She built an empire before 30, closed deals that made grown men sweat through their suits. Never lost, never hesitated, never looked twice at anyone who wasn't worth her time. Then one Tuesday morning, in the marble lobby of her own building, Ava Sinclair made a joke, the kind you throw out without thinking, the kind that's supposed to land and disappear. It didn't disappear. The man in the work boots looked her dead in the eye and said 5 words that stopped the most powerful woman in the room cold. And nothing was ever the same. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the end, because what happens between these two people will change the way you think about power, trust, and what it actually costs to win. The elevator doors opened at 7:43 in the morning, and Ava Sinclair walked out like she owned the place. She did own the place. Technically. Through a holding structure that her lawyers had spent 11 months organizing, Sinclair Group LLC held the primary lease on the building at 840 Meridian Avenue, a sleek 40-story tower in the financial district of Chicago that served as the corporate headquarters of Sinclair Capital Partners, the investment firm she had built from a single desk and a business plan she'd written at age 24 on a Delta flight from Boston to O'Hare. She was 30 now. Some days it felt like 100. Her assistant, Madison, was already walking in step beside her before Ava's second heel clicked against the polished marble floor. "Good morning. You have the Hargrove call at 8:15, the contracts review at 10, lunch with Delgado from Sterling at 12:30. I pushed it from noon because you said you hated eating before 12 and the CFO wants 15 minutes before end of day." Madison barely looked up from her tablet. "Also, facilities left a message. They're doing the 4th floor HVAC work today. Contractors are in the building." "Fine. They said there might be some noise between—" "Madison." Ava stopped walking. "Is any of that going to affect my 8:15 call?" "No." "Then it's fine." She started walking again. The lobby of 840 Meridian was not especially grand by Chicago standards, but it had good bones. High ceilings, a wall of glass that caught the morning light clean and sharp, a reception desk of pale ash wood that Ava had replaced herself 2 years ago because the original looked like something out of a mid-range hotel. Small things mattered. They always did. You could tell everything about a company by the way its lobby looked at 7 in the morning before anyone important was supposed to see it. That was why Ava had started making unannounced visits. No warning calls, no itineraries sent ahead. She just showed up, walked the floors, watched the way people moved when they didn't think she was looking. It was not a management style that won her any warmth from the staff, but it was effective, and Ava had long since decided she could live without being liked as long as the numbers moved in the right direction. She was halfway to the elevator bank, the second bank, the executive elevators, which required a key card, when she noticed the man. He was standing near the east wall, beside a large stack of ventilation panels that hadn't been there the night before. Work boots, dark canvas pants with a pocket on the thigh, a gray long-sleeve shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows. He had a clipboard in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear, and he was studying a blueprint that he'd unfolded against the wall, one corner of it held in place by his thumb. He was not looking at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Not his face, not anything else. Just the fact that he was the only person in the lobby not looking at her. It was a small thing, probably meaningless. But Ava noticed small things, and this one stuck. She slowed. Madison noticed and slowed too, stylus hovering. The man turned one corner of the blueprint up, frowned at something, made a small mark with the pencil, and went back to studying. He was focused. Completely, genuinely focused. In the distracted, slightly irritated way of someone trying to solve a real problem rather than look like they were solving one. There were 3 other workers visible, 2 near the service corridor and 1 by the building directory, and all 3 had glanced at Ava when she stepped off the elevator. Because people did. She knew that. She was the CEO. She was dressed well. She carried herself in a way that announced something, and people looked. It was just a fact. But this one didn't. Ava wasn't sure what made her do it. Later, she would blame it on the early hour, the second cup of coffee she hadn't finished, the general dull edge of a Tuesday that hadn't asked her permission before arriving. Whatever the reason, she said it. "Hey!" She stopped about 6 feet from him. "You!" The man looked up from the blueprint. His eyes were dark, not dramatically dark, just a settled, steady kind of dark. And they landed on her without any particular reaction. No flicker of recognition, no adjustment of posture. He just looked at her the way someone looks at a person who said a word. Yeah? When's the last time you went on a date? It came out exactly the way she intended. Casual, slightly arch, the kind of throwaway line executives use to cut tension in a room or fill 5 seconds with something forgettable. A joke you made and then kept walking. She was already half turning back toward the elevator. The man looked at her for a moment. He tilted his head slightly, the way you do when you're actually considering something rather than just waiting for your turn to speak. He folded the blueprint in half against his forearm. Right now, he said, with you. Ava turned back around. She wasn't sure exactly what she had expected. A laugh, maybe, the nervous kind, or a shrug and a mumbled nothing, the way most people responded when someone with a title said something unexpected at them. She had not expected this, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of apology. She stared at him. He looked back without flinching. "Excuse me?" she said. "You asked when my last date was." He tucked the pencil back behind his ear. "I said right now, with you." A small pause. "You started it." There was no smile. That was the thing. It wasn't a flirtatious smirk or a practiced line delivered with one eyebrow raised. He said it the way someone states a fact, not cruelly, but matter-of-factly, with just enough of a dry edge underneath it that she couldn't decide if he was serious or not. She decided he wasn't. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, and looked at him for one more second. "Get back to work," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She walked to the elevator. She used her key card. She did not look back. The doors closed. Madison said nothing for 4 full seconds, which was a record. "Don't," Ava said. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." "I really wasn't," Madison said, and then ruined it by pressing her lips together very tightly. The 8:15 call ran long because Hargrove's legal team had decided, at the last possible moment, to raise concerns about indemnification language in the third addendum. Concerns that Ava's own legal team had already addressed in writing twice, which meant either Hargrove's people hadn't read their emails or they had and were stalling, and Ava suspected the latter. She handled it. She always handled it. That was not modesty. It was just accurate. She had a particular kind of focus in high-pressure conversations, the kind that came from years of being underestimated and learning to hold the whole shape of an argument in her head while also listening to every word being said. She could negotiate, and she could wait, and she knew which one to do when. The call ended at 9:42. She had 17 minutes before the contract's review. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the carafe on the credenza. Real coffee, not from the machine, brewed by whoever had opened the executive kitchen that morning, and stood at the window. The lake was visible from here, just barely, a flat blue strip between the buildings to the east. She liked it, something about the constancy of it. Chicago could do almost anything to you, and the lake just sat there, indifferent and permanent. She was not thinking about the man in the lobby. She was thinking about the acquisition. Nexus Technologies. That was the name of the company she had been trying to acquire for 7 months. It was a mid-sized technology firm, not flashy, not the kind of company that got featured in glossy profiles, but genuinely good, solid IP portfolio, a cloud infrastructure division that had outpaced every projection for 3 consecutive years, and a small but exceptional engineering team that had somehow avoided the talent bleed that hollowed out most tech firms in their category. The acquisition made strategic sense in a way that went beyond the usual justifications Ava had to make to her board. It wasn't just about the numbers, though the numbers were excellent. It was about the gap it would fill, a gap she'd been watching grow for 18 months while her competitors ignored it, which meant she had a window, and windows did not stay open. The problem was the owner. Nexus Technologies was private, single-owner controlled, and the owner had been almost pathologically difficult to pin down. She'd had her team run the standard preliminary research 7 months ago when the acquisition idea first formed, and what they came back with was surprisingly thin. The company was incorporated in Delaware, offices in Chicago and Seattle, founder listed as L. Parker. And that was more or less it. No social media presence, No conference speaking history, no Forbes profile, no Inc. feature, no LinkedIn page with the usual tedious recitation of achievements. She had sent 3 written acquisition proposals through the proper channels. 2 were acknowledged and gently deflected. 1 was not acknowledged at all. She'd had her M&A team try to arrange a direct meeting 4 times. Each time, they were routed to a representative from Nexus's legal team who was polite, professional, and completely impenetrable. It was unusual. Most founders, even cautious ones, even the ones who'd been burned before, were at least willing to sit across a table and hear a number. The flattery of it, if nothing else. The chance to feel that their thing was wanted. L. Parker, apparently, either didn't need flattery or didn't care about it. And Ava, who had built her career partly on her ability to read people, had never actually seen the man. She thought about that, standing at the window with her coffee. Something was off about the acquisition. She had felt it for weeks, a low-frequency wrongness she couldn't entirely locate, like a vibration in a wall that only you can hear. Her CFO thought she was being paranoid. Her M&A lead thought the owner was simply a difficult negotiator doing what difficult negotiators did. But Ava had a very specific kind of instinct. Not mystical, not infallible, just the accumulated pattern recognition of someone who had spent 6 years making high-stakes decisions faster than the information warranted. And her instinct said there was something she wasn't seeing. She finished her coffee. She put the mug down. She had 14 minutes before the contracts review. She didn't think about the man in the lobby. The afternoon was full. Contracts review bled into a budget conversation with her CFO, Daniel Reyes, who was good at his job and deeply committed to expressing concern about everything. Ava liked him for the same reason she liked difficult books. He slowed her down in ways that occasionally turned out to matter. The sterling lunch with Delgado was productive, but not exciting. They were courting her firm for a co-investment in a logistics company outside Detroit, and Ava was 70% interested, which was enough to keep the conversation alive, but not enough to commit. She was back in her office by 2:30, door closed, jacket off, working through the Nexus file for the 4th time in 2 weeks. It was the ownership structure that kept snagging her. The more she looked at it, the more the picture felt slightly out of focus. Not wrong exactly, but not quite complete. Nexus Technologies filed on time, paid its taxes, had clean audits going back to founding, no litigation, no creditor issues. An absolutely unremarkable regulatory history. But the operational control was strange. The company was built, at its core, like someone had designed it to look smaller than it was. She was still working through it when Madison knocked. "Procurement audit team is wrapping up on 4, Madison said through the door. "They'll have the summary to you by 5. "Fine." A pause. "Also, the facilities contractor, the HVAC thing. One of the workers came to the reception desk to let us know they found a problem with one of the secondary ducts that's going to extend the work into tomorrow. Wanted to make sure you knew." "That's what facilities is for." "Right. I told them that, just passing it along." Ava pulled the Nexus file back in front of her. "Did they say which contractor?" "Sorry?" "Facilities used a third-party contractor for the HVAC work. Did they say which company?" She could hear Madison checking something. "Parker and Associates Contracting. They've done work for us before, apparently. 2 years ago, the lobby floor. Last year, the basement electrical." Ava stopped. Parker. It was a common name. An extremely common name. There were probably 400 Parkers within 3 miles of this building. There was absolutely no reason to attach significance to a common surname appearing in 2 unrelated contexts. She attached significance to it anyway. "Madison," she said, "pull the incorporation documents for Parker and Associates Contracting and put them on my desk." A longer pause. "Incorporation documents for a building contractor?" "Yes." "Okay." A shorter pause. "Any particular reason?" "No." The documents were on her desk in 22 minutes. She read them in 4. Parker and Associates Contracting was a small firm founded 6 years ago, operating primarily in commercial construction, renovation, and facilities management in the greater Chicago area. Revenues were modest. Staff of 12. Clean bonding record, no liens, no disputes. The registered agent was listed as L. Parker. Liam Parker. The middle initial matched the Nexus filing. The address on file was different. That meant nothing. Subsidiary structures use separate addresses all the time. But the dates matched in a way that made the hair on Ava's arm stand up. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, certain way of a person who has just heard the click of something falling into place. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. The man in the lobby wasn't a contractor. Or rather, he was a contractor, but that wasn't all he was. The man in the lobby was the man she had been trying to get a meeting with for 7 months. The man who owned the company she needed. The man who had quietly, without any announcement, walked into her building in work clothes with a clipboard and a pencil behind his ear and looked at her without any particular reaction when she made her stupid joke. And then he had answered her, right now, with you. She exhaled through her nose. Well, she said, to no one. She didn't go down to the 4th floor immediately. She spent 10 minutes deciding not to go down to the 4th floor, and then she went down to the 4th floor. It was loud. The kind of mechanical noise that fills a space and makes conversation difficult, which was fine because Ava had not yet decided what she was going to say. She walked through the temporary plastic sheeting that separated the work area from the rest of the corridor and found herself in a half-dismantled section of ceiling, exposed ductwork running in all directions. 2 workers in safety glasses doing something technical to a junction that Ava did not understand. Liam Parker was at the far end, crouched on one knee beside a panel on the floor, writing something on his clipboard. She walked toward him. He looked up when she was about 8 feet away. Not startled, just registering. "Miss Sinclair," he said. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. She was the CEO of the company. Her photograph was in the lobby and probably in 6 other places in this building. He'd known her name this morning in the lobby when she'd made her joke, and he had said nothing about it. She stopped in front of him. "You want to explain something to me?" He stood up. He was taller than she'd registered this morning. Not especially tall, but enough that she had to adjust her eyeline slightly. "What would you like me to explain?" he said. "Who you are?" "I'm a contractor," he said. "Currently doing HVAC remediation on your 4th floor. We found a secondary duct with a 17% airflow degradation that's going to cause..." "You're Liam Parker." He didn't flinch. He also didn't confirm it immediately, which told her he was thinking about how to handle this rather than simply reacting. That told her something. "I am," he said after a moment. "You own Nexus Technologies." "Among other things." A very small pause. "My company also holds the facilities contract for this building, which I think you know since you pulled my incorporation documents about 40 minutes ago. Your assistant called our registered agent." Ava stared at him. "Standard practice," he said. "We flag any document requests from client organizations. Nothing dramatic." "You've been in my building," Ava said slowly, "doing work while I've been trying to reach you for 7 months. I've been aware of your acquisition interest, yes, through channels." Her voice was steady. She was good at keeping her voice steady. "Through layers of representatives who told my team you weren't available for a direct conversation." "I wasn't." He said it simply, without apology. "I wanted to see your company before I had a conversation with you about whether I was willing to hand it over to your company." That seemed reasonable. "You could have just asked for a facility tour." "I could have," he agreed. "But then you would have prepared for it. I didn't want to see what you prepared. I wanted to see what you had." Ava opened her mouth and then closed it. There was an argument in there somewhere about professionalism, about proper process, about the number of billable hours her M&A team had spent going in circles. But the argument kept sliding out of reach because what he was describing was not actually unreasonable. It was the same instinct that drove her own unannounced lobby visits, the desire to see things without a filter. She hated that. "And what did you see?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, not appraisingly, more like someone reading something they've read before, checking it against their memory of it. "A well-run company," he said, "tighter than most. Better culture than the size usually allows. Some tension in the middle management layer you probably already know about." A pause. "And a CEO who asks contractors about their love life before 8 in the morning." Despite herself, Ava felt the corner of her mouth move. She stopped it. "The question was rhetorical," she said. "It usually is," he said. He didn't elaborate. One of the workers called something from the far end in a question, and Liam glanced over, held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, then looked back at Ava. "I'll be here until 5:30, he said. "If you want to have an actual conversation, we could do that, or we could keep doing this." "What is this?" "Whatever you want to call it." He picked up his clipboard. "I'm not trying to be difficult, Ms. Sinclair. I just don't do things on a timeline that isn't mine." He walked toward the far end of the space, toward the worker waiting. He didn't look back. Ava stood in the half-dismantled corridor with exposed ductwork overhead and a fine layer of drywall dust on the toe of her left shoe, and she thought, "This man is going to be the most complicated thing that has happened to me in a very long time." She turned around and went back to her office. They talked at 5:15. Not in her office. She'd considered it and then decided against the power geometry of it, which was a choice she made sometimes and always slightly resented making. She suggested the coffee bar on the building's 3rd floor, which at that hour was mostly empty. Liam came the way he'd been all day. Same clothes, forearms still slightly dusty, clipboard tucked under his arm like a habit. He ordered black coffee. She ordered the same, which was not usually what she ordered but felt like the right choice somehow. They sat across from each other at a small table near the window. Outside, the city was doing its 5 o'clock thing, the slow compression and release of traffic, the shift change quality of the light. 7 months is a long time, Ava said. It is, he agreed. Most companies lose interest after 2. I don't lose interest. I know, that's part of why I'm still here. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Tell me what you actually want with Nexus. Not the proposal language, what you actually want. Ava looked at him. She was good at distinguishing between people who asked questions because they wanted information and people who asked because they wanted to see how you answered. This was the latter. The infrastructure division, she said. Primarily, your cloud architecture team has built something in the last 3 years that takes a specific problem most enterprise clients don't even know they have and solves it in a way nobody else is doing. I want that inside my portfolio before someone else figures out what it is. She paused. The rest of the company is good. I'd keep it intact. I don't gut acquisitions. Your record supports that, he said. Mostly. Mostly? Alderman Tech, 2022. You absorbed the engineering team and discontinued the product line within 14 months. Ava's jaw tightened slightly. That product line had no path to profitability. The team thought it did. They just needed capital. They needed capital and time, and in that market I had neither to spare. She held his gaze. I made a call. I'd make it again. He nodded. Not in agreement necessarily, more in the way of a person who was noting the answer rather than approving it. What happens to my team if the acquisition goes through? I retain them. For how long? Contractually, I'd offer 2 years. Practically, good people who do good work don't get let go. My turnover rate on acquired staff is 14% over 5 years. You can verify that. I already did, he said. She blinked. When? 3 months ago. He took a drink of his coffee. I've been doing my own due diligence on you, Ms. Sinclair. It seemed fair. There was a silence, not an uncomfortable one, exactly. Just a silence with weight in it, the kind that happens when 2 people are recalibrating. You've been running parallel research on my company, Ava said. Yes. While working your facilities contract in my building. The facilities contract is legitimate, he said. I wasn't here to spy. I was here to work and to observe. Both things can be true. And what did your research tell you? He set down the mug. For a moment he looked out the window at the city, something slightly quieter crossing his face. Then he looked back. That your company is in a more delicate position than your public posture suggests, he said. That someone on your board or close to it has been creating conditions for a leadership challenge. And that you probably already sense it, which is why you've been pushing harder on this acquisition than the timeline strictly requires. The air in the room went very still. Ava kept her face neutral, which took effort. Because he was right. He was specifically, uncomfortably, accurately right in a way that should not have been possible from outside the organization. That's a fairly specific read, she said. From due diligence. I read carefully, he said. He didn't offer anything else. She looked at him across the small table. The noise from the city came through the glass in a muted, compressed way. A bus passed. Somebody on the sidewalk below was laughing at something. What would it take, she said, for you to agree to a formal meeting? Liam Parker picked up his clipboard, uncapped his pen, wrote something, turned the clipboard around, and slid it across the table. It was a date. 2 weeks out. A Saturday. That's a weekend, she said. It is, he said. I have a specific condition for the meeting. Which is? He paused. He seemed for the first time slightly less than completely comfortable. My daughter's school has a science fair that morning. I go every year. I won't move that for anything. He pulled the clipboard back. The meeting would need to be in the afternoon. If that doesn't work for your schedule, it works, Ava said. She didn't hesitate. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, just a small, almost imperceptible softening at the edges that was there for a second, and then gone. 2 weeks then, he said. He stood, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and picked up his mug. He drank the last of his coffee standing up. Thank you for the coffee. I didn't pay for it yet, she said. I know. He set the mug down. Good night, Miss Sinclair. Ava, she said. He paused, looked at her. Good night, Ava. He walked toward the elevator. This time she did watch him go. She sat with her untouched coffee and the feeling that she had just had a conversation that would matter more than she currently understood. The thing about days that change you is that they don't announce themselves. You find out later, looking back, when the shape of it becomes visible. Ava went home that night to her apartment, a clean, minimal space in the Gold Coast that she'd decorated once and then left alone, because she was there mostly to sleep and think and occasionally eat food that wasn't ordered at a desk. She had a view of the lake. She stood at the window with the city spread out behind her reflection and thought about the day with the methodical precision she applied to most things. The man was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. The usual founder type, perhaps. The particular combination of ego and anxiety that came with building something and being asked to give it up. She had sat across from dozens of them. She knew the texture of that conversation. Liam Parker didn't have that texture. He had something else. A steadiness that was not arrogance, that was important, but was also not deference. He spoke to her the way someone speaks when they are neither trying to impress nor trying to protect themselves. Just directly, without the layers. It was disorienting. She thought about that. Why would that be disorienting? Because, she realized, she spent almost her entire working life in rooms where everyone was either performing for her or performing against her. People pitched or people pushed back, and both of those things had a quality of theater to them that she'd learned to read and navigate. She was very good at the theater. Liam Parker was not performing. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She also thought about what he'd said. The delicate position, the leadership challenge, the board, Victor Kane. She said the name out loud, quietly, just to hear it. Victor Kane was 61 years old and had been on the board of Sinclair Capital Partners for 3 years, having joined through an investor introduction that had seemed at the time like a straightforward alignment of interests. He had money and access and a network in a sector where Ava was still building her presence. She'd been grateful for him briefly. Lately, she was less grateful. He had been asking questions, not in the way board members asked questions in good faith, probing the reasoning, pushing on assumptions, the kind of friction that made decisions stronger. He was asking questions the way someone asks questions when they already know the answer and are building a record. Small, accumulating doubts, always framed as concern, always delivered in the language of stewardship and prudent governance. She had noted it. She had not yet determined whether it was significant. Liam Parker, who had never been in the same room with Victor Kane, had determined it was significant from reading public and semi-public documentation. That either meant he was very smart, or there was something more visible about the situation than Ava wanted to believe. She wasn't sure which thought was more troubling. She went to bed at 11. She was awake at 5:30. She went for a run along the lakefront in the gray early cold, which was the closest thing she had to a meditation practice, and she let her mind move the same way her legs did. Not forcing direction, just covering ground. By the time she was back at her apartment, showered, dressed, and in the elevator with her coffee and her phone and the low-grade continuous hum of everything that needed doing, she had decided two things. 1. She needed to take a harder look at Victor Kane. 2. She needed to know more about Liam Parker than his incorporation documents and his acquisition resistance were telling her. The elevator opened at the lobby. The HVAC team was already there, setting up for the second day of work. She scanned the space automatically. Liam was not there. She felt the absence with a specificity that surprised her, and then immediately disliked herself for it. She went to work. She had her research director pull everything available on Liam Parker that afternoon. What came back was thin in some places and unexpectedly deep in others. He was 32. Born in Cincinnati, moved to Chicago at 24. Engineering degree from Ohio State, which he'd paid for largely through summer construction work, according to one very old local newspaper article about a scholarship recipient that had been digitized without much care. He'd started in commercial development, actual construction, physical buildings, before pivoting to technology infrastructure in his late 20s, a transition that nobody seemed to have predicted and that he'd never explained publicly because he didn't give interviews. Nexus Technologies was founded 5 years ago. It had grown in near silence. There was one photograph of him in any accessible digital record, a group shot from a Chicago Business Association event 3 years ago. Background, almost fully cropped out. You could see his shoulder and half his face. It was unhelpful. He had a daughter, Emma, 6 years old. Her mother was not in the picture. There were no records of a marriage or a divorce, which meant either a relationship that never went legal or a situation that had been handled very quietly. Emma appeared in exactly one place, a local news story about an elementary school STEM fair from 8 months ago. She was photographed standing next to a model of a water filtration system she'd apparently built herself. She was beaming. She had her father's dark eyes. Ava looked at that photograph for a long time. There was something about it, not the child specifically, not any particular detail, but the evidence of a life that looked nothing like the life she expected from someone running 2 companies and navigating a high-stakes acquisition standoff. The model water filtration system, the beaming smile, the school gymnasium backdrop. She thought about the condition he'd set for the meeting. "I won't move that for anything." She believed him. She closed the file and went back to work, and for the rest of the afternoon she was efficient and focused and did not think about photographs of 6-year-olds standing next to water filtration systems. She thought about it at home, though, in the quiet, the way you think about things you put down and find you've been carrying anyway. She'd made a decision once, years ago, about what her life was going to be shaped around. The decision was the work. She'd made it cleanly, without drama, and she'd kept it. She didn't have regrets about it exactly, but she had moments, not often, and she didn't dwell in them, where she saw the edge of what the decision cost. This was one of those moments. She went to sleep. She woke up. She went to work. 2 weeks moved forward. The Saturday meeting was at 2 in the afternoon at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park that Liam had suggested, not in the financial district, not at either of their offices, just a neighborhood place with good light and tables that weren't too close together and coffee that came in actual mugs. Ava got there first. She sat with her notes and her coffee and her very controlled awareness that she had spent more time than usual deciding what to wear, which was a khaki blazer over a dark shirt and which she was not going to examine further. Liam came in at 2:01. He was wearing a different kind of clean than his work clothes, dark jeans, a blue shirt, collar open. He'd made an effort, she realized, small effort, understated, real. He sat down. He had a small smear of something, glitter, maybe, on the inside of his right wrist that he either hadn't noticed or had decided not to address. She did not mention it. "How was the science fair?" she asked. Something lit in his face. "She built a solar-powered water pump," he said. "Smaller than the one from last year, but it actually worked this time. She cried a little when it ran. Happy crying." He picked up the menu, glanced at it, put it down. "Second place. She thought she deserved first. She was probably right, but I told her the judging was subjective." "Was it? Honestly? The kid who won built a robot that could sort recycling. It was legitimately impressive. He smiled briefly. Emma disagreed. She sounds like someone I'd like, Ava said, and then felt slightly surprised that she'd said it. Liam looked at her. She is someone you'd like, he said. It wasn't flattery. It was just a statement. They ordered, they talked, and for 2 hours they sat across from each other and had one of the best business conversations Ava had had in years. Not because it was smooth, but because it wasn't. He pushed back on 3 of her core assumptions about the integration timeline. She pushed back on 2 of his valuation anchors. They disagreed, clearly and specifically, about the risk profile of the cloud infrastructure team's key dependencies, and neither of them backed down. And at the end of it, they were both leaning forward over the table, with their mugs pushed to the side and the scratch paper she'd pulled from her bag covered in handwritten notes. "You're not what I expected," Ava said at some point. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Not this." He nodded slowly. "I know what you expected. I've seen your acquisition playbook. You expected someone who'd been worn down by the process, who'd be glad to finally be in a room with you, who'd be negotiating from a position of wanting it to be over." He looked at her. "I'm not in that position." "No," she said. "You're not." "That's not obstruction," he said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not being difficult. I just need to know that what I've built lands somewhere it'll be treated right, by someone who gets what it actually is." A pause. "I'm still figuring out if that's you." The bluntness of it should have landed as an insult. It didn't. It landed as something rarer. Honesty without aggression. The kind that only happens when someone is secure enough not to dress it up. "Fair," Ava said. They sat with that for a moment. "I'll need another meeting," Liam said. "Not a business meeting." "Then what kind?" He thought about it. "The kind where we're not both performing due diligence," he said. "Where it's just talking. I find I make better decisions about people when I know how they talk about things that aren't work." Ava opened her mouth to say that she was very busy and her schedule was tight and there was a process for these things. "Okay," she said instead. He smiled. Not the small, controlled expressions she'd seen in the lobby or on the 4th floor. A real one, slightly crooked, that reached his eyes and changed his whole face for a moment. It did something to her she was not prepared for. She looked down at her notes. Outside, the afternoon light had gone golden. That particular Chicago September gold that sat on everything for about 40 minutes before the sky went gray. Kids were riding bikes on the path, visible through the window. A dog was misbehaving about a squirrel. Ava Sinclair sat across from a man in a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, with glitter on his wrist and an impossible negotiating position, and a 6-year-old who'd cried happy tears over a solar water pump. And she thought, not in words exactly, but in the particular full-body way of things that matter, that she was in territory she didn't have a map for. She folded her notes and put them in her bag. "Same time next week?" she said. Liam picked up his mug. "Same time next week," he said. The city moved outside the window. The light held on a little longer than expected. Ava finished her coffee. Something had started. She wasn't sure yet what it was or how much it was going to cost her, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to control it. The week after the Lincoln Park meeting, Ava did something she almost never did. She went back and read her own notes twice. Not for the business content, she had that memorized, but for something else she couldn't quite name. She was looking for the shape of the conversation, the places where it had moved unexpectedly, the moments where she'd said something she hadn't planned to say and then watched his face process it without judgment, without the usual reflexive repositioning people did when they were calculating how information affected them. She found 7 such moments. She stopped counting at 7 because the exercise was starting to feel like something she shouldn't be doing with company time. She put the notes in the Nexus acquisition folder, which was now the thickest physical folder on her desk, and she told herself the next meeting would be different, more structured, more controlled. She would bring a formal term sheet draft and they would work through it point by point, and the conversation would stay where it belonged. She believed that for most of the week. On Thursday, Victor Kane called her. Not through Madison, not through the formal board communication channels. He called her personal cell phone at 6:58 in the evening, which was a number she'd given him 2 years ago when their relationship was warmer and which she now slightly regretted sharing. Ava. His voice had that particular quality she'd come to recognize, smooth in the way of someone who had learned smooth as a skill rather than a disposition. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I'm finishing up. She was still at her desk. She almost always was at 6:58. What is it, Victor? Just wanted to check in. Board meeting's coming up, and I've been hearing some, I don't want to say concerns, that's too strong, some questions from a few of the members about the Nexus timeline. The board will have a full acquisition update at the meeting, Ava said. Same as always. Of course. Of course. A pause. It's just 7 months is a long time for a deal this size to still be in preliminary stages. And given the capital allocation you've committed to the due diligence process, some of the members are wondering about the opportunity cost, whether the resources might be better deployed on something more achievable. Ava kept her voice even. The Nexus acquisition is achievable. I'm sure you believe that. Another pause. I just want to make sure we're aligned going into the meeting, as a friend. She thought, you are not my friend. She said, I appreciate the heads up, Victor. I'll see you at the meeting. She ended the call. She sat with it for a moment. The particular cold sensation of a threat that had been wrapped well enough that you couldn't directly address it without looking paranoid. She thought about what Liam had said. Someone on your board or close to it has been creating conditions for a leadership challenge. He'd said it as observation. It was landing now as something more specific. She pulled up Victor Kane's profile on her internal board documents. She'd looked at it before many times, but she looked at it now with different eyes, not evaluating whether he was effective as a board member, but mapping who he talked to, what votes he'd influenced, what positions he'd taken in the last 18 months that she'd dismissed as cautious conservatism and was now reconsidering. The pattern was subtle. That was the thing. It was the kind of pattern that only emerged when you were looking for it, and you only started looking for it when someone had given you reason to. She wrote one word in the margin of the page she'd printed. Why? Not, what is he doing? She could see what he was doing now that she was looking. The question was the one underneath. Why was Victor Kane, who had joined this board with a clean track record and legitimate credentials, now apparently working toward her removal? What did he gain from it? Who was he working with? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew the shape of the question, and for Ava, that was always how it started. She called Daniel Reyes at home. He answered on the second ring, slightly out of breath. She'd interrupted something, probably his evening run. I need you to pull Victor Kane's board expense reports for the last 14 months, she said. All of them, and cross-reference any third-party consultants he's engaged on board business. A short silence. That's an unusual request. Yes, it is. Can you have it to me by Monday? I can have it to you by Saturday night. Monday is fine. She paused. Daniel, be quiet about it. Understood, he said, and she believed him. She got home at 8:30. She stood at her kitchen counter and ate leftovers directly from the container, which was not a habit she was proud of, and looked out at the lake, which was dark and invisible but present the way things you can't see are sometimes more present than things you can. She thought about Liam Parker and his daughter's solar water pump, and the glitter on his wrist, and the way he smiled when it was real. She thought, this is getting complicated. She thought, it was already complicated. You just weren't paying attention. She went to bed and slept 6 hours, which was about average. The second meeting was Saturday again, same coffee shop, same time. Ava had not brought a term sheet draft. She wasn't sure when she'd made that decision, but she was aware she'd made it. Liam was there when she arrived, which surprised her. She was 7 minutes early, and he was already at the table with 2 coffees, one of which he slid toward her when she sat down. You ordered for me, she said. Black coffee, he said. Same as last time. I can get you something else if you want. No. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Thank you. He nodded. He looked like he'd slept better than she had, which she noted without attaching anything to it. They talked for a while about nothing consequential. A piece of city news she'd caught on the radio that morning, a construction project that had apparently been visible from his office window for 8 months and showed no signs of completion. Normal things. The kind of things that only felt normal because they'd stumbled into a register neither of them usually used in professional contexts. Then he said, without any particular transition, "Something's bothering you." Ava looked at him. "I have a lot on my mind." "I don't doubt that. Specifically, though, something happened this week." She considered him across the table. "You can't know that. You've been holding your coffee with both hands since you sat down. You do that when you're thinking hard about something, not when you're just cold." He shrugged. "I've been watching people a long time. It's a side effect of being quiet." She could tell him it was nothing. That was the move. Deflect, redirect, keep the professional perimeter clean. She had been maintaining professional perimeters since she was 24 years old, and she was very good at it. "Victor Kane called me Thursday," she said instead. Liam went still. Not a dramatic stillness, just the small, particular cessation of movement that happened when someone's attention fully arrived. "What did he say?" "Nothing actionable. That's what made it notable." She explained the conversation, the smoothness of it, the framing of concern, the reference to board questions about the acquisition timeline. She watched Liam's face while she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform concern. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's positioning," Liam said, "but he needs more support to move." That call was him testing whether you'd engage defensively, whether you'd start managing optics instead of finding out what he's actually doing. I pulled his expense reports. Something shifted in Liam's expression. "Quietly?" "Yes." He exhaled through his nose, something that was almost approval. "Good." He turned the mug in his hands. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information, not as, not as me managing you. Just say it. When I was doing my due diligence on your company, I came across some financial documentation that seemed to originate from inside Sinclair Capital Partners, but wasn't in any of your public filings. Specifically, projected revenue figures for the Nexus acquisition that had been distributed somehow to a third-party investment group." He met her eyes. "The figures were manipulated. They'd been made to look worse than your actual internal projections, as if the deal was less viable than your own team believed it to be." The coffee shop was quiet around them. A couple at the next table was talking about a movie. Someone's phone buzzed twice and went quiet. Ava felt the information settle in her. She noticed her own physiological response to it, a cold that started in her chest and spread outward, not fear exactly, more like the body's recognition of something serious before the mind has finished processing it. "You found this 3 weeks ago," she said. It came out flat. "Yes." "And you're telling me now?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" The question had an edge to it, a real one. She wasn't performing anger to see how he'd respond. She was genuinely unsettled, and she needed to know the answer. Liam looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't know you yet," he said. "I needed to know whether you were someone who'd use that information the right way, or whether you'd move on it fast and create a situation that got messy and uncontrollable." A pause. "And I needed to know whether what was happening was connected to me, to whether my company was the mechanism. I wasn't sure who I could trust." It was an honest answer. She recognized honest answers. She'd heard enough dishonest ones to know the difference. It was also, she recognized, the exact same calculus she would have run in his position. She still didn't like it. "I need to see what you found," she said. "I know." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded envelope. He slid it across the table. "Copies. I kept the original secured elsewhere." She picked up the envelope. She did not open it in the coffee shop. "How did this documentation reach a third-party investment group?" "That's the part I couldn't trace completely. It went through an intermediary consulting firm. One that I've since found has a prior financial relationship with Victor Kane personally, not through the board." He paused. "It's circumstantial at this stage, but it's a short chain." Ava looked at the envelope in her hands. "Victor has been feeding bad information about the acquisition to outside investors," she said. "Investors who might want to short our position or position themselves to benefit from a leadership change. That's my read." "If this is what it looks like, it's not just a boardroom power play," she said. "It's securities manipulation." "Yes," Liam said. That's why I wanted to be careful about how I gave it to you. He leaned forward slightly. Ava, what you do with this matters as much as the information itself. If you move wrong, he has time to cover the trail. If you move right, he doesn't, she finished. He nodded. She sat with the envelope in her hands and the weight of it, which was not just paper. She thought about Daniel Reyes pulling the expense reports. She thought about the board meeting coming up in 11 days. She thought about 6 years of building something that could be taken apart by someone she'd trusted enough to put in a room with her company's future. She was angry. She let herself feel it for approximately 4 seconds, the clean, clarifying kind that came from being betrayed by someone who'd banked on her not looking closely enough. Then she put it somewhere it wouldn't cloud her thinking. I won't move until I've verified it, she said, and I'll need my own documentation independent of yours. That's the right call. And when I do move, I'm going to need a very specific kind of board meeting. Liam picked up his coffee. What kind? The kind that ends with everyone in the room understanding exactly what happened. Not a quiet removal, not a settlement and an NDA and a press release about pursuing other opportunities. She looked at him directly. He tried to destroy my company from the inside for personal gain. I'm going to make sure that's the story. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's risky. I know. It might turn some of the board against you, even if you're right. Executives get uncomfortable when things get too visible. I know that too. He considered her. There was something in his expression she'd seen before, that assessing quality, checking something against a previous version of it. Why not just take the quiet path? It would be easier. Because easy isn't the point, she said. Quiet means he gets to land somewhere else and do this to someone else. And it means the people on my team who worked on this acquisition for 7 months don't know why they nearly lost their jobs over it. She set her mug down. I'm not interested in easy. He held her gaze, and then slowly, in the way of someone who has been waiting to see if a thing was true and has just gotten confirmation, he smiled. Not the small, careful expression from their earlier meetings, the real one, the slightly crooked one that changed his whole face. Ava looked away first. She didn't entirely mean to. Okay, she said. Tell me everything you found. They stayed in that coffee shop for 3 more hours. The afternoon light moved across the table and the couple at the next table left, and new people arrived and the place had its full weekend rhythm going around them, entirely unaware that 2 people were quietly reconstructing the architecture of a betrayal in the middle of it. At some point the conversation drifted, the way long conversations do, into other territory. He talked about Emma, not constantly, not in the way of parents who made their children their entire personality, but the way you talk about something that is genuinely central to your life without being performative about it. Emma had asked him that week why some clouds were flat on the bottom. He'd looked it up, they'd read about it together. She'd declared that the answer was disappointing, but okay. Ava laughed at that, a real laugh without managing it. She sounds like someone who's going to be difficult when she's older, Ava said. Oh, absolutely, Liam said. I'm preparing myself. He paused. She asks about her mom sometimes. Not often anymore, but sometimes. A beat. Her mom left when Emma was 14 months old. It wasn't a dramatic situation. She just wasn't ready to be someone's parent. I don't blame her for that. But Emma's going to have questions when she's older that I can't fully answer. The frankness of it was quiet and unrehearsed. He wasn't asking for anything with it. Not sympathy, not a particular response. It was just something that was true. How do you explain it to her now? Ava asked. I tell her that some people aren't ready to be parents when they have kids, and that doesn't mean anything about who Emma is. It means something about where that person was. He shrugged. It's approximately true. We'll revisit it. Ava nodded. She was thinking about her own parents, her father specifically, who'd had his own particular way of not being ready that had expressed itself as absence rather than departure. They hadn't spoken in 4 years. She didn't usually talk about that. My father was around, she said, but he wasn't really present, if that makes sense. He was there physically and somewhere else entirely the rest of the time. She paused. I spent a long time trying to perform my way into his attention. Then I stopped trying. When did you stop? When I was 22 and he forgot my college graduation was happening. She said it without drama. He wasn't malicious, he just cared about other things more. Once I understood that clearly, it was easier. Easier, Liam said. Not skeptically, more like he was noting the word she'd chosen. Less confusing, she amended. Not easier, less confusing. He nodded, like that made more sense. Outside the window, the Chicago afternoon was doing its September thing. Leaves starting at the edges, that particular quality of light that was still summer adjacent, but carrying a message about what was coming. Ava watched a kid on a scooter negotiate a crack in the sidewalk with enormous concentration. Can I ask you something? Liam said. Go ahead. The company, Sinclair Capital, when you're not fighting for it, when it's just yours and it's working the way you want, does it make you happy? It was such a direct question that for a second she couldn't find an answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because the question assumed she'd examined it, and she wasn't sure she had. I don't think happiness is exactly the right frame, she said finally. What is? She thought about it honestly. It makes me feel competent. And that's not a small thing. I spent a long time feeling like I was behind, like I had to prove something to people who'd decided their verdict already. When the company works, when the strategy lands, when a deal closes that I knew was right before anyone else did. She stopped. It's not joy exactly. It's more like evidence. Evidence of what? That my judgment is good, that the work was worth it. A pause. That I was right. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lonely thing to be chasing, he said, gently. Not as a judgment. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Yeah, she said after a moment. I know. Neither of them said anything for a little while. It was the comfortable kind of quiet that you couldn't plan for and couldn't manufacture, and that arrived when it did as a small gift. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his expression went from that quiet, open quality to something more immediate. Emma's with my neighbor, he said. Her daughter's having a bit of a meltdown, and she's asking if I can come back. He was already reaching for his jacket. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, Ava said. Go. He stood, tucked his jacket on, picked up his phone. Then he paused, and he looked at her across the table with a directness that had become, she'd noticed, his particular default. This was a good afternoon, he said. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't calculated. It was just what it was. It was, she said. He nodded once and left. Ava sat with the envelope of documents and the 2 empty coffee mugs and the late afternoon that was going gold through the window, and she thought about what he'd said. That's a lonely thing to be chasing. She thought, you're not wrong. She thought, that's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. She thought, I should look at these documents. She looked at the documents. They were as bad as he'd described, worse in some places. The manipulation was sophisticated, not crude number faking, but something more insidious. Selective presentation, strategic omissions, figures that were technically accurate in isolation and deeply misleading in context. Someone had put real effort into it, the kind of effort that spoke to both capability and intent. She sat in the coffee shop until it started to fill up with the early dinner crowd, and the noise level rose around her, and she was the only person at a table alone with a stack of documents and an empty mug that someone came to clear twice before she let them. Then she gathered everything, put it in her bag, paid for the coffees. She paid for all of them, both days, and left a better tip than was strictly required, and walked out into the Chicago evening. The air had the first real bite of fall in it. She walked a block before she flagged a cab because she wanted the 1 block of walking, the cold air, the city noise. She thought about what was coming, the verification, the documentation, the board meeting, the specific and careful way she was going to have to construct an argument that was airtight, because if she went after Victor Kane and it wasn't airtight, she handed him the story he'd been building, and she would not do that. She thought about Daniel Reyes, who was reliable and discreet. She thought about her legal team, who were good and would need to be brought in at the right moment and not before it. She thought about Liam, who had been sitting on this information for weeks, and had chosen to wait until he could put it directly in her hands rather than use it himself. even though using it himself would have served his own interests significantly. She'd been thinking about that since he said it, the choice embedded in it. He'd watched her, assessed her, decided she was someone who deserved the chance to handle her own situation, and then he'd handed her the tools and gotten out of the way. Nobody did that. Not in her world. The cab arrived, she got in. The driver had music going quietly. Something with brass, something old. She didn't know what it was. 840 Meridian, she said. Then, actually, no, Gold Coast. She gave her home address. Work could wait until morning. For once. She watched the city through the window, the lights coming on as the dark came up. The particular density of a city Friday evening, all that motion and overlap, and the constant texture of other people's lives running alongside yours without touching. She was not, she noticed, thinking about the acquisition. She was not running the board meeting in her head or mapping the evidentiary chain or calculating the timeline. She was thinking about a coffee shop and late afternoon light and a man who'd said something true without being asked to. It was the kind of thinking she didn't usually allow herself. She allowed it until the cab stopped. Then she got out, went upstairs, and didn't allow it anymore. Mostly. The following week was work. Deep, thorough, unglamorous work. She and Daniel spent 4 hours on Tuesday going through Kane's expense documentation, and what emerged was a picture that made her stomach tighten, not from surprise, but from the particular displeasure of having a suspicion confirmed. Victor had engaged a consulting group called Meridian Advisory Group. There was an almost funny irony in the address sharing her building's street name. 7 months ago, just about the time Ava had formally initiated the Nexus acquisition process. The engagement was billed as Strategic Communications Advisory, with a scope so vague it could mean anything. The invoices were real. The work product, as far as Daniel could find, did not exist in any documented form. "It's a pass-through," Daniel said. He was sitting across from her in her office with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Or close to it. Money moves to the advisory group. Advisory group provides access or information or whatever the arrangement is. No clean record of what was actually exchanged. We need the investors on the other end," Ava said. "That's going to be harder. We'd need to—" "I know what we'd need. I'm not asking you to do it. I'm making a note." She wrote something down. "What I need from you right now is a documentation trail that is clean enough to bring to outside counsel without explanation. Everything from your end." "You're going to legal?" "I'm going to legal, but quietly. Not the firm on retainer. They have too many existing relationships with board members. I need someone independent." Daniel took his glasses off. "Ava, if this goes where I think it's going where the evidence goes," she said. "I'm not building a case I don't have. But if I have what I think I have, I'm not burying it quietly either." He looked at her for a moment. "This could blow up badly. For everyone. Including you." "I know." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll have it packaged for you by Friday," he said. She thanked him. He left. She sat in her office with the afternoon city below her and the lake to the east and the very specific quiet feeling of someone standing at the edge of something big. Not afraid, not exactly confident, just clear. The way you felt when the picture finally resolved and you could see all its parts at once, and you knew what had to happen. She had 11 days until the board meeting. She thought about calling Liam. She didn't do it, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure yet what she'd say, and she had enough sense to know that calling someone just because you wanted to hear their voice was not the kind of thing she was equipped to do cleanly yet. Maybe not ever. But she was aware of the impulse in a way she hadn't been aware of an impulse in a long time. She went back to work. The case was building, document by document, the way they always built. Slow, and then suddenly very fast. She didn't know yet exactly what the board meeting was going to look like, but she knew one thing with certainty. Victor Kane had made a mistake. Not in the scheme itself. That was well constructed, carefully covered. He'd made a different kind of mistake. He'd underestimated her. They always did, and they always seemed genuinely surprised when it turned out to matter. The independent attorney Ava chose was a woman named Patricia Holt, 60 years old, semi-retired from a career that had included 2 decades as a federal prosecutor before she moved to private practice. She operated out of a small office in the West Loop with 1 paralegal, no receptionist, and a filing system that appeared to be organized by a logic only she understood. She had been recommended by a former colleague of Ava's who described her in 3 words: slow, thorough, unmovable. Ava called her on a Wednesday morning and had the first meeting that Friday afternoon. Holt read through everything Ava brought: the documents from Liam, Daniel's expense report analysis, her own timeline reconstruction, without speaking for 41 minutes. Ava knew because she watched the clock, not impatiently, just because she needed to do something with her hands, and watching the clock was better than the alternatives. When Holt looked up, she said, "How clean is your source on the Nexus documents?" "Very," Ava said. "I'll need to know who it is eventually." "Eventually," Ava agreed. "Not yet." Holt accepted that with a small nod. She turned back to the documents. The expense chain is suggestive, but not sufficient on its own. The Meridian Advisory Group connection is your strongest thread. If they can be tied to specific investors who acted on the manipulated projections, she tapped a page. This is where it becomes something beyond a board dispute. I know. Securities manipulation carries personal liability. If Kane understood what the downstream use of that information was going to be, we're in serious territory. Holt looked at her over the top of the reading glasses she'd put on at some point without Ava noticing. "Are you prepared for serious territory?" "Yes." "It will get loud. At some point, it will become public. You won't be able to control the timing of that once certain agencies get involved." "I understand." "Your board will not be comfortable. Some of them may distance themselves from you before they distance themselves from him, because that's what boards do when they sense instability. Even boards that ultimately do the right thing." Ava thought about that. How long will it take to build something solid enough to move? Holt considered. "If you can get me access to the Meridian Advisory Group's investor client list, even indirectly, 2 weeks, maybe 3. She paused. "You have a board meeting in 11 days. 9, now. Too soon to move formally, but..." Holt folded her hands on the desk. If someone is planning to use that board meeting to initiate a leadership challenge, they'll need a specific trigger, something that makes the acquisition look like a failure, and you look like someone who let it happen. Have you thought about what that trigger might be? Ava had thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for days, moving the pieces around, running probabilities. The most obvious trigger was a public signal that the Nexus acquisition had collapsed, that the owner had formally walked away. That would give Victor exactly the narrative he needed, that Ava had wasted 7 months and significant resources on a deal that was never viable, and that her judgment couldn't be trusted at the level of a firm this size. The trigger required Liam to walk away, which meant Victor either had leverage over Liam or he had a plan to make the acquisition collapse without Liam's cooperation. The second option was possible, but harder. The first option was the one that had been sitting at the back of her mind for 3 days, like a low-grade headache she kept almost addressing, and then not. She hadn't told Liam about this part, not because she was trying to protect him, but because she needed to think through it herself first, and because there was something uncomfortable about the possibility that he might already know and had chosen not to tell her. She didn't think that was true, but she needed to be honest with herself about the fact that she didn't fully know yet, and that not knowing was a real thing she had to account for. She left Holt's office at 5:30 and walked 2 blocks in the early October cold before she made the call. Liam picked up on the 3rd ring. She could hear Emma in the background. Something about a show, a request, the particular intensity of a 6-year-old who needed an answer immediately. "1 second," he said, away from the phone. Then, "Yeah, sorry, what's going on?" "I need to ask you something directly," Ava said, "and I need a direct answer." A short pause. She heard a door close somewhere. He'd moved to a different room. The background noise dropped. "Okay," he said. "Has anyone contacted you in the last few months with any kind of offer or pressure related to the acquisition? Anyone outside the normal process? Anyone who wasn't my team?" The silence was 2 seconds long, which was 1 second longer than it would take to say no if the answer was simply no. "Yes," he said. Ava stopped walking. She was standing on a sidewalk in the West Loop with her coat collar up and her breath showing in the cold air and a specific kind of feeling in her chest that was not quite betrayal but was adjacent to it. When? She said. 6 weeks ago. A man called my office, not my personal line, the Nexus main line, and said he represented a group of investors who were considering an alternative acquisition offer. He said if I accepted their offer instead of yours, the terms would be significantly more favorable. A pause. He also implied that your firm's position was less stable than it appeared, and that going through with your acquisition might result in Nexus being part of a company that was itself in transition. Transition, Ava said flatly. His word. And you didn't tell me? No. His voice was steady, not defensive, just honest. I didn't tell you because I didn't know, at that point, whether it was connected to you or separate from you, whether it was someone using your instability or someone creating it. A beat. I also wasn't sure it was my information to hand over. I was still deciding what I was doing with the acquisition. She stood on the sidewalk. A bus went past. Someone exited a building behind her and walked away without looking at her. Liam. She kept her voice controlled. We have been having conversations for weeks. I've been building a case based partly on information you gave me, and this whole time you were sitting on the fact that someone had directly approached you as part of the same scheme. Yes, he said. I know how that sounds. How does it sound to you? A pause. Longer than the others. It sounds like I made a decision to protect myself and my company's position while I was still uncertain about where your interests and mine actually aligned. Another pause. And I'm telling you now because they do align. And because you just called and asked directly, and I'm not going to lie to you. She exhaled. The cold caught it. She wanted to be more angry than she was. She was trying to locate the clean, simple anger of being kept from information she needed. But it kept getting complicated by the fact that she understood exactly the calculation he'd made because it was the same one she would have made, and by the fact that he'd answered honestly when she asked, without maneuvering, without pretending the silence hadn't happened. Do you remember the name he gave? She said. He said his name was Gary Ellison. I don't know if that's real. The investment group? He didn't name one. He said he'd follow up with documentation. He never did. A pause. I think the call was a probe, testing whether I was open to it. When I didn't respond with interest, they didn't follow up. Ava filed that. She'd pass it to Holt. It might or might not connect to anything, but it was another thread. We need to meet, she said. Not the coffee shop, in person, in a place where we can work. I need to walk you through where things stand with the legal side. Tomorrow? He said. Tomorrow evening, my office. She paused. Is Emma okay for that? My neighbor, he said. She's good about it. 7 o'clock, Ava said. I'll be there, he said. She hung up and started walking again. The city was full of its early evening self. People releasing from offices, the particular relief and tiredness of the end of a workday, restaurants warming up, the smell of exhaust and food and cold air that was uniquely Chicago in autumn. She was frustrated with him. She was also, and this was the part she turned over carefully, the way you turned over something that might be fragile. She was also aware that she wasn't finished trusting him. That frustrated her more than the withheld information did. She didn't fully understand her own responses here, and she was not accustomed to that. She got back to her office, worked until 8:30, and went home. She slept 5 hours. The next morning, she had a conversation she'd been putting off. Madison had been her assistant for 3 years, and in those 3 years, she had witnessed more of Ava's operational reality than almost anyone. She was 26, organized, smart in a practical way that was more valuable than people realized, and she had a quality Ava had noticed in their first interview and hired her for. She was curious without being indiscreet. She asked sharp questions, held the answers carefully, and did not share things she wasn't supposed to share. Ava called her in and closed the door. I need to ask you about something that may seem unrelated to your job, Ava said. It isn't. Madison sat. Okay. In the last 6 months, have you noticed anything unusual about how internal documents were being accessed? Specifically financial projections? Acquisition-related materials? Any access patterns that seemed off? People requesting documents they didn't normally have reason to access, that kind of thing. Madison was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was recalling something, not deciding whether to answer. There was something, she said. About 4 months ago, someone from the board liaison office requested the Nexus acquisition sensitivity analysis, the full version, not the summary. I flagged it at the time because the request came through a general board inquiry form instead of through you directly, which wasn't normal protocol for that document type. She paused. I mentioned it to David in IT, and he said it was probably a process error and logged it. I didn't escalate it because it seemed like a documentation issue. Do you remember who made the request? The form listed the requester as Victor Kane's office. Madison met her eyes. I should have brought that to you. You flagged it. That was the right move. Ava kept her voice level. I need you to get me a copy of that IT log entry, quietly. And I need you to not discuss this with anyone. Madison nodded. She didn't ask why. Madison. Ava looked at her. I know this is not what you expected when you came in this morning. No, Madison said. But it's fine. A small pause. Is the company going to be okay? It was a simple question, not naive, just direct, the way young people who'd earned some trust sometimes asked things that their older colleagues had learned to dress up in more protective language. Yes, Ava said, and she meant it, not as reassurance, as fact. It is. Madison left. Ava sat with the new information. The IT log would give her a documented access trail inside the company. That was significant. It moved the picture from circumstantial to concrete, from someone who might have been careless with information to someone who had specifically acquired documents they had no legitimate reason to have. She called Holt at 10 o'clock. I have a new thread. I'll have documentation to you by end of day. Timeline's tightening, Holt said. I know. Work with it. 7 that evening, Liam came to her office. It was the first time he'd been there, not the building, which he knew better than she did in some ways, but the executive floor, her actual workspace. He walked in wearing dark pants and a jacket that was a slight step up from what she'd seen him in before, which she noted and did not comment on. He looked around the office with the attentive reading quality she'd come to expect from him, the way he took in spaces as information. You redecorated, he said, 2 years ago. How would you know? The photographs on the building's website are from the previous interior. The desk placement is different. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. And there's no plaque with your name on the outside of the door, which the former CEO apparently had. I remember the mounting holes in the wall from when we were doing the lobby renovation. She looked at the wall beside the door. There were barely visible 2 small filled holes where something had once been anchored. You notice a lot, she said. Construction habit. You look at walls differently. He settled back in the chair. It was a visitor's chair and slightly too low for the desk, a proportion she'd never quite fixed. Tell me where things stand. She walked him through it. Everything. Holt, the expense chain, the Meridian Advisory Group, Madison's IT log, where the evidentiary picture was and where it still had gaps. She told it clean and linear, the way she organized information in her head without editorializing. He listened the same way he always listened, completely, without performing engagement. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The board meeting is in 7 days, he said. Yes. He's going to move at the board meeting. He's been building toward it for months, and he won't wait. If he waits, the documentation trail you're building gets longer and the risk to him goes up. He turned something over in his mind. He needs the acquisition to look dead before the meeting. He needs to walk in with evidence that your biggest strategic bet fell through, which means he needs you to walk, Ava said. Yes. He looked at her. I expected the contact at some point. That's partly why I waited. I wanted to see how they were going to try to use me. A pause. I think there may be another approach coming, something more direct than a phone call from an intermediary. You think someone will contact you directly? I think someone will contact me with something that looks like a better offer and is actually designed to produce a very specific outcome, public withdrawal from your acquisition, something you'd have to acknowledge to the board. He paused. If that happens, I want to be clear about how I'm going to respond. How are you going to respond? I'm not going anywhere, he said. Came out simply. No performance in it. Just a fact. Ava looked at him across her desk. There was something about the steadiness of him, in this room, in this chair, at the center of a situation that had potential consequences for him too, for his company, for the outcome of a deal he'd spent months evaluating. That struck her in a way she was having difficulty categorizing. He wasn't here because she'd asked him to stand firm. He was here because he'd made a decision, and he was stating it. You understand that if this goes sideways, your company is potentially in the middle of a public securities investigation, she said. As a witness, not a subject, he said. There's a difference. A pause. And yes, I understand. I decided that was acceptable. When did you decide that? He considered the question. Probably around the second Saturday in Lincoln Park, he said. When you told me you weren't interested in the quiet path. There was a moment in the room, not dramatic, just real. The particular quality of two people who have arrived, by separate routes, at the same place. Ava looked at her desk. She had a habit of looking at her desk when she needed a second, which was a tell she was aware of and had never entirely eliminated. Thank you, she said. She didn't say it often. It came out slightly rough at the edges. Don't thank me yet, he said. It hasn't worked yet. I know. She looked back up. Are you hungry? I haven't eaten since noon and I'm going to need to eat before I can think clearly about the next phase. He blinked, as if the question had arrived from a direction he hadn't been tracking. Yes, he said. I'm hungry. There's a Thai place 2 blocks from here that delivers in 20 minutes, she said. I can tell Madison to... Madison's gone home, he said. She glanced at the time, 8:47. Right, she paused. I'll order it myself. He smiled at that. Not the full one, just the small, dry edge of it. Do you know how to use the app? I know how to use the app, she said, with a dignity that was only slightly undermined by the fact that she had to look up the restaurant name on her phone. They ate at the small conference table in her office from the containers, which was not how Ava usually used the conference table, and they talked about the case for another 40 minutes, and then, in the way the conversation had developed a habit of doing, drifted into other territory. He told her about the technology division at Nexus. Specifically, a problem they'd been chasing for 2 years in the infrastructure architecture that a 28-year-old engineer named Rosa had solved 3 weeks ago in a way nobody expected. She'd come in on a Saturday morning with a hand-drawn diagram and 20 minutes of explanation, and the whole room had gone quiet the way rooms went quiet when something genuinely smart walked into them. He talked about it the way he talked about Emma's water pump, with a specific, uncurated pride, the kind that didn't need an audience to exist. That's what I've been trying to tell you, Ava said. That team. That's why the acquisition isn't just financial. I know, he said. That's why I've been careful. She looked at him. You really would have walked away from the whole thing if the deal felt wrong. Yes. Even with the offer I made, even with the valuation. The valuation is good, he said, but the valuation isn't why I worked for 5 years. He picked up a piece of the food. Rosa has turned down 3 other offers in the last 8 months, all higher than what she's making now. She stays because of the culture, because of how decisions get made, because she trusts the environment she's working in. He paused. I'm not going to take her money and then put her somewhere that'll grind that out of her. Ava was quiet. That's not idealism, he said, slightly wrong-footing her expectation. It's strategy. People like Rosa are the actual asset. The IP is secondary. I know that, Ava said. I know you know it. I've seen how you run things. He looked at her. I just needed to say it out loud. She understood. She'd needed to hear it out loud too, not to be convinced, but to confirm that they were talking about the same thing, that the acquisition, if it happened, was going to be built on a shared understanding of what the asset actually was. They finished eating. He helped her gather the containers into the trash bag, which felt like an oddly domestic moment in the context of her office at 9:15 at night, and which she filed away without comment. He put on his jacket. He picked up his phone. He stood for a moment near the door with the slight, unresolved quality of someone who has something else to say and hasn't decided yet. I want you to know something, he said, before the next week gets complicated. Okay. The acquisition aside, he held her gaze. The last few weeks have been different For me. I'm not making a pitch. I just wanted to say it. Ava looked at him. She was not a person who struggled for language. She made her living, in part, on the ability to find the right word at the right moment. But in this particular moment, with this particular man in her office doorway, she had nothing polished to offer. Different for me, too, she said. It was plain. It was true. That was all she had. He nodded once and left. She stood in the office with the faint smell of Thai food and the city moving below the windows and the specific, unmoored feeling of someone standing on territory that recently shifted. She had 6 days until the board meeting. She had a case that was almost solid, but not yet. She had a man who'd said, "I'm not going anywhere," in the same tone most people said good morning, and meant it. She sat back down at her desk. She pulled up the Nexus acquisition file. She pulled up the Holt documentation. She pulled up the IT log that Madison had sent at 5:30. She worked until 11. She went home. She slept 4 hours, which was not enough, and was awake at 3:15 and lay in the dark with the case running in her head and underneath it, below the architecture of it, the things she kept coming back to without intending to. Different for me, too. She'd meant it. That was the thing. She'd said it and she'd meant it, and she hadn't had to think about whether to say it, which was new. She didn't know what to do with new. She got up at 5:30 and ran 5 miles in the cold and the dark, the lakefront empty in a way it never was during the day. And she ran the case and the week ahead and the board meeting and Victor Kane's particular face when he was performing concern. And underneath all of it, below the strategy and the evidence and the timeline and the things that needed to happen in the right order, she ran the feeling of something starting that she hadn't planned for and couldn't entirely control. She ran until she couldn't feel her ears. Then she went home and got ready for work. 5 days. The case was nearly there. Daniel brought her the final documentation the next afternoon. The Meridian Advisory Group had, according to incorporation records filed in 2 states, a single named principal officer. The name was Gary Ellison, which meant the man who had called Liam 6 weeks ago was not using a pseudonym. He was using his real name, probably because he considered himself beyond the kind of risk that required disguising it, which told Ava something important about how Victor Kane viewed his own position. Too secure to be careful. People who were too secure to be careful were, in Ava's experience, the easiest ones to bring down. Not because they were careless, exactly, because they'd stopped imagining the version of events where they lost. She sent everything to Holt. Holt called her back within 2 hours. "It's there," Holt said. "It won't be the cleanest case a jury's ever seen, but it's there. The chain from Kane to Ellison to the investors who traded on the manipulated projections, it's circumstantial in places, documented in others. It's enough to take to the board. It's enough for the board to act. It may ultimately be enough for a regulatory referral." A pause. "But Ava." "What?" "I'm going to say this as someone who has seen these things go every possible direction." Holt's voice was careful. "The way you present this at the board meeting matters enormously. You go in hostile, you go in emotional, you give anyone in that room a reason to make it about your behavior instead of his. And it gets muddied. You go in clean, documented, measured. I know how to present in a boardroom," Ava said. "I know you do," Holt said. "I'm telling you anyway." "Good," Ava said. "Keep telling me things I know. It helps." Holt made a sound that might have been a laugh. 4 days, she said. "I'll have the presentation materials to you by Friday evening." "Thank you, Patricia." A pause. Holt almost never paused. "You earned this," she said, and hung up. Ava sat with the phone in her hand. Outside, Chicago was gray and cold and completely itself, indifferent to her in the best possible way. 4 days. She had 4 days to prepare for the most important board meeting of her career, to present evidence of a conspiracy that had been running under her company for months, to do it in a way that was precise and measured and incontrovertible, and to do it in front of a room that included the man who'd built the conspiracy, who would be sitting 12 feet from her, watching, waiting for a single mistake. She had done harder things. She had built a company from nothing. She had survived rooms full of people who'd decided before she opened her mouth that her judgment wasn't worth taking seriously. She could do this. She looked at the lake, still there, flat and gray and indifferent and permanent. She went back to work. On the third day before the meeting, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. It said, "Miss Sinclair. I represent a group of investors with a proposal that may be of interest to you regarding your current corporate situation. I'd welcome a brief conversation at your earliest convenience. G. Ellison." She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Holt, copied Daniel, and typed one word back. No. She put the phone face down on her desk and kept working. The 2 days before the board meeting, Ava barely slept. Not from anxiety exactly. She'd learned years ago to distinguish between the anxiety that was just noise and the alertness that meant something mattered enough to keep your body awake. This was the second kind. Her mind ran the presentation in the background of everything she did, the way you ran a demanding piece of music you were preparing to perform. Not obsessively, just persistently, checking the transitions, the pacing, the places where something might slip. Holt delivered the presentation materials Friday evening as promised. Ava spent Saturday alone in her apartment going through them, reorganizing 3 sections, rewriting 2 pages of the narrative summary in language that was more precise and less prosecutorial because Holt was right about that. The tone mattered as much as the content. You didn't walk into a boardroom and accuse. You walked in and showed. You let the evidence do the work that anger wanted to do because evidence stayed in the room after you'd finished talking, and anger just made people uncomfortable and gave them somewhere else to look. She printed the final version twice. 1 copy for the meeting, 1 for her own record. She was standing at her kitchen counter drinking coffee at 7 Saturday morning when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Liam. She picked up. It's early. I know. I've been up since 5. He sounded slightly rough around the edges, the way people sounded when they'd been awake too long with something on their mind. Emma had a bad night. Nightmares. She's fine now. She's asleep. But... a pause. I've been sitting here and I keep thinking about the board meeting. What about it? I want to be there. Ava set down her coffee mug. Liam. Not in the room. I know I can't be in the room. I'm not on your board. I'm not a party to the meeting. But I want to be in the building, in case something goes sideways and you need... I don't know, I just don't want to be sitting in my kitchen waiting for a phone call. She understood the impulse. She also recognized that there were practical reasons why having him physically present was complicated. If Victor made an issue of it, if someone recognized him, if his presence became a story that overshadowed hers. But she also thought, he's been carrying this with me for weeks. He found the evidence before I did. He held it carefully and gave it to me at the right moment, and he said he wasn't going anywhere, and he meant that in all the ways the sentence could mean. 3rd floor coffee bar, she said. 8:45. The meeting starts at 9. A short silence. Okay. Don't tell anyone you're there. Don't approach the board floor unless I ask you to. Understood. She picked her coffee back up. How's Emma now? Sleeping like a person without a single problem, he said. The way kids do. Something in his voice softened around that. She told me before she fell back asleep that she dreamed about dinosaurs. I asked if they were scary. She said no, they were just very big and confused. Ava smiled at the window. That's a reasonable description of most things. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Get some rest, he said. You too. She stood at the window after she hung up, with Chicago gray and quiet below her in the early morning, and the lake doing its flat, permanent thing to the east. And she thought about a man sitting in his kitchen at 5 in the morning while his daughter slept, thinking about a board meeting he wasn't invited to, calling because he wanted to be present anyway. She thought, I have no idea what to do with you. She thought, I think that might be the point. She went back to the presentation. She worked until noon. She made herself eat something. She slept 3 hours in the afternoon, which was better than she'd expected, and woke at 4 with the case completely clear in her head, every piece of it in order, the way a room looks when you've finally finished cleaning it. She was ready. The board meeting was scheduled for a Sunday, unusual but not unprecedented. Ava had called it herself 3 weeks ago, before any of this had fully resolved, when the original purpose was a quarterly update and an acquisition status report. The timing, which had then seemed merely convenient, now felt like something she'd arranged better than she knew. Sunday mornings, the building was quiet. The marble lobby held the particular stillness of a large space without its usual population. The cleaning crew had been through the night before. Everything smelled slightly of the industrial lemon product they used on the floors. Ava arrived at 8:15, so she walked the lobby, which was a habit she'd never fully explained to anyone. She just did it, a single circuit of the space before she went upstairs, the way some people touched wood or checked their pockets. The building was hers. She wanted to feel it as hers before the meeting. She took the executive elevator to the board floor. She set up the presentation materials personally. She didn't ask Madison to come in on a Sunday for this. She did it herself, because she needed to be in the room alone for a while. She arranged the printed summaries at each seat except one. Victor Kane's seat would not have a summary. That was deliberate. She wanted him to watch the presentation without a copy to annotate, without the ability to mark up objections in advance. She tested the screen. She tested the remote. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the empty chairs and thought about each person who would sit in them. 7 board members. She had 4 she was confident in. 1 was uncertain. 2 were aligned with Kane. Not personally, not from malice, just from the particular kind of conservative risk aversion that attached itself to whoever seemed most stable, and Kane had been performing stability for months. 4 confident votes was enough, if the evidence was what she believed it was. It would have to be. At 8:40, she went down to the 3rd floor. Liam was already there. He was sitting at the small table near the window, the same table they'd used in their earliest conversations here, which she suspected was not accidental, with a coffee and his phone face down on the table. He'd worn a jacket, dark, well-fitting. He looked, she thought, like someone who understood the weight of the morning without making it theatrical. She sat down across from him. She didn't order anything. She'd had enough coffee, and her hands were steady, and she wanted to keep them that way. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her. Actually. She considered the question honestly, which was something she'd started doing more with him, considering instead of immediately producing an answer shaped for the audience. "I feel clear," she said, which is as close to okay as I get before something like this. He nodded. That was enough for him. "If it goes wrong," she said, "I need you to know that it doesn't change. The acquisition isn't contingent on this. Whatever happens in that room today, my offer stands." He shook his head slowly. "That's not why I'm here." "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway, so there was no ambiguity." He looked at her across the table. "There isn't any ambiguity," he said. They sat for a few minutes without talking. The city came through the window in the particular muted way of a Sunday morning, quieter, slower, a different texture than the week. Somewhere on the floor below, an elevator opened and closed. At 8:55, Ava stood up. "I have to go up," she said. Liam stood too. He reached out and, briefly, without making anything of it, touched her hand. Just that. A second of contact. "You built this company," he said quietly. "They know that, even the ones who don't want to." She looked at him. Something in her chest that had been held tight all morning loosened just slightly. "Don't go anywhere," she said. "I told you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She went upstairs. The board members arrived between 9 and 9:10. 7 people, ranging in age from 44 to 70, all of whom had known her for years in varying capacities, all of whom had opinions about her that she knew and couldn't entirely account for in advance. Victor Kane arrived at 9:08. He was wearing a charcoal suit that was very slightly too good for a Sunday morning meeting, which told her he'd thought about the morning the same way she had and had dressed for an event rather than a meeting. His expression was composed, the particular composed quality of someone who had a plan and was watching its runway. He took his seat. He looked at the empty place in front of him, the absence of the summary document, and she watched his eyes move across the table, noting that every other seat had one. He looked up at her. She was already looking at him. She gave him nothing. She just started the meeting. "Thank you for coming in on a Sunday," she said. "I'll keep the early part brief. I have a standard quarterly summary in your packets, page 1 through 12. I'll ask you to review that on your own time. There are no surprises in the financial picture." She clicked to the first slide. What I want to focus this morning is something that emerged in the course of the Nexus acquisition due diligence. Something I think the board needs to understand fully before we discuss any further decisions about the acquisition's future or about this company's leadership. She felt the room's attention change, not dramatically, just the small collective shift of people who had expected one kind of morning and were now recalibrating. She started with the Nexus acquisition itself. She laid out the full timeline: 7 months, the acquisition rationale, the strategic value, the state of negotiations. She was clear and specific, and she gave the board the version of the story that explained why this deal was real and was working, because she needed them to understand what was worth protecting before she showed them what had been working against it. She moved then to the document anomaly. She called it that, a document anomaly. She explained what Madison had flagged 4 months ago, what the IT log showed, what it meant for the access trail. Around the table, faces were doing different things. The 4 she was confident in were following closely, their expressions tightening as they understood the direction. The uncertain one, Raymond Choi, 60, careful, someone who made decisions slowly and stuck to them once made, was leaning slightly forward. The 2 Kane-adjacent members were watching her with the studied neutrality of people who didn't yet know which way to land. Victor Kane was perfectly still. She moved to the Meridian Advisory Group. She presented the incorporation records, the payment structure, the connection to Kane through the expense report trail. She did not use the word conspiracy. She did not editorialize. She simply showed the chain, link by link, and let the room build the word itself. When she showed the slide with the manipulated projection figures, the Nexus acquisition numbers that had been distributed through Meridian to outside investors, figures that made the acquisition look failing while her own internal analysis showed the opposite, she heard someone at the table make a small sound, not loud, just the involuntary noise a person made when something landed harder than expected. She looked at the room. Raymond Choi had both hands flat on the table in front of him, which was a posture she'd never seen from him before. The woman to his left, Diane Farrow, 70, former federal appellate judge, had gone completely still in the way that judges went still when they were making up their minds. She moved to the Gary Ellison contact, the unsolicited approach to Nexus's owner. The text message Ellison had sent to her 3 days ago, which she put on the screen in its entirety. Then she paused. She looked at the table. She let the silence do some work. "I want to be clear about what I'm presenting," she said. "I'm not presenting a conclusion. I'm presenting documentation that I believe warrants a formal independent investigation into whether a board member has used his position and access to manipulate proprietary information for personal financial gain, and whether that manipulation constitutes securities fraud." She clicked the remote and the final slide appeared, a summary of the evidentiary chain, clean and numbered. "I'm asking the board to vote today on initiating that investigation. I'm asking that the board member in question be suspended from voting privileges pending its outcome." She put the remote down. "I'm available for questions." The silence that followed was approximately 6 seconds long, and it felt much longer. Then Victor Kane spoke. "This is—" He stopped. He started again. "This is a fabrication." His voice was composed. Very slightly too composed, the way a voice got when the person producing it was working hard to keep it that way. "What you're looking at is a selective and misleading presentation of documents that have been taken out of context by someone who is clearly motivated to—" "The documents are reproduced in full," Ava said. "Nothing has been excerpted. The complete originals are available to any board member who requests them from independent counsel." She held his gaze. "Would you like to walk through any specific document and tell me which part is out of context?" A beat. "I'd like to know," Kane said with careful steadiness, "where this alleged documentation originated. Because I suspect the source is not someone who has the company's interests in mind. In fact, I suspect the source is someone with a direct financial interest in destabilizing—" "The source documentation comes from 5 independent origins," Ava said. "Internal IT logs, board expense reporting, Delaware and Illinois incorporation records, a legal analysis from independent outside counsel, and a direct communication to my personal phone number, which is in the packet." She paused. "None of those sources are the same person. None of them have a financial interest in this outcome." Another pause. "Do you have a specific objection to any of those sources, Victor?" He was quiet. She watched him calculate. She watched the calculation come up short. Ava? It was Diane Farrow. Her voice was measured in the way of someone who had spent a career choosing words with precision. How long have you been aware of this? I began assembling the picture approximately 3 weeks ago. I have been working with independent counsel since then to verify the documentation before bringing it to the board. You didn't bring it to us sooner. I brought it to you when I had something verifiable to bring. She met Farrow's eyes. If I'd come to this table 3 weeks ago with suspicions and incomplete documentation, I would have been presenting a very different kind of meeting. Farrow considered that, nodded once. That's fair. Raymond Choi cleared his throat. The acquisition status, he said. Is Nexus still viable? Is the seller still... The acquisition is proceeding, Ava said. The owner is aware of the situation and has confirmed his position has not changed. Choi looked at her. You've spoken with him? Yes. Something shifted in the room, a small collective recalibration. Because what that meant was that the story Kane had been building, the story where the acquisition was failing, where Ava's flagship strategic initiative was collapsing around her, was not the story. The story was the opposite. Kane understood that the room had just shifted. She watched him understand it. I'd like to propose, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, a fractional loss of the composed quality, like a signal fading, that before any votes are taken, we table this discussion and bring in legal counsel. Independent legal counsel has already reviewed the documentation, Ava said. That review is in your packets, Appendix C. She looked at the room. I'd like to call the vote. Diane Farrow seconded it. That was the moment, Ava thought later. That was the moment when she knew. Because Farrow had been cautious and careful, and she had seconded the vote without hesitation. The vote on initiating the independent investigation was 5-1. Victor Kane voted against. The uncertain board member, Raymond Choi, voted in favor, which was the vote Ava had been least sure of, and which she registered with a specific, quiet relief. The vote on suspending Kane's voting privileges pending the investigation was the same, 5-1, Kane's own hand raised in objection to a motion that would remove his voice from the proceedings. It was not a dramatic ending. There was no raised voice, no moment of theatrical collapse. Kane sat in his chair and voted against both motions in full knowledge that the votes would pass, with the contained fury of someone who had built something carefully and watched it come apart in the wrong direction. When the second vote was counted, Farrow looked at him. Victor, she said, you should speak with your counsel. He looked at the table. He looked at Ava. And there was something in his expression, not remorse, not quite, but the beginning of the understanding that he had made a specific mistake and could now see its shape clearly. I'll see myself out, he said. He stood. He gathered nothing, because there was nothing in front of him to gather. He walked to the door. He opened it. He did not look back. The door closed. The room was quiet. Then Thomas Webb, the oldest board member, who had not spoken a word during the entire meeting and who Ava had always found impossible to read, leaned back in his chair and said, without particular inflection, well, that needed to happen. The tension broke the way tension broke, all at once, a kind of collective exhale, people shifting in their seats, the room becoming human again after 40 minutes of being very tightly wound. Farrow looked at Ava. You did this correctly, she said. That matters. I had good help, Ava said. She meant Holt. She meant Daniel. She meant Madison, who'd flagged a document access request 4 months ago and kept the IT log. She meant Liam. The meeting ended 20 minutes later on the quarterly business, which felt almost surreal in its normality, walking through financial summaries after what had preceded it, but which was also, Ava thought, exactly right. The company had a meeting. The meeting had a full agenda. The work continued. That was the point. She walked out at 11:17. The board floor was empty by then, except for the residual feel of the morning. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at nothing particular. Her phone buzzed. Daniel, I heard. Are you okay? She typed back. Yes. Thank you for everything. She took the elevator to the third floor. Liam was still there. She'd half expected him to be, and she'd half expected him not to be, and she wasn't sure which expectation she'd have been more unsettled by. He was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and he looked at her face, and he didn't ask. He just waited. 5-1, she said. He let out a breath. Kane? The one, suspended from voting pending investigation. She sat down at the table. Her legs were not entirely reliable, which was information she kept to herself. Farrow seconded the vote. Choi came through. Liam sat across from her. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you hungry?" She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. It came out a little rough, but it was real. "I haven't eaten since last night," she said. "There's a diner 3 blocks from here," he said. "Actual diner, not a concept diner. Booths, bad lighting, excellent eggs." "Yes," she said. They walked out of the building together, which was the first time they'd done that, left through the lobby side by side, past the reception desk, through the glass doors, and out into the October Chicago morning. The air was cold and sharp and completely indifferent to everything that had happened upstairs. The diner was exactly what he'd described, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu in 20 years and didn't intend to. They took a booth near the back. The coffee was bad. Ava drank 2 cups anyway. They didn't talk about the meeting right away. They talked about other things, small, low-stakes things. Emma's current phase of asking questions about space that Liam was increasingly underqualified to answer. A piece of construction on the north side of the city that Liam had opinions about from a structural standpoint. A book Ava had been trying to finish for 3 months and kept abandoning at the same chapter. It was the most ordinary conversation she'd had in weeks. "What happens now?" Liam said eventually. "With Kane. Holt is filing a referral with the SEC on Monday. That process will take months, maybe over a year. It may or may not result in formal charges. He'll almost certainly resign from the board before he's formally removed, which is how these things usually go." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "He'll be fine, probably. People like Victor usually land somewhere. They lose one position and find the next one." She paused. "But the documentation is on record. That follows him. Is that enough for you?" She thought about it. "I wanted it public," she said, "not as punishment, because it's true. And true things should have a record." She looked up. "Yes, it's enough." He nodded. Their food arrived. The eggs were, in fact, very good. They ate for a while in the comfortable quiet that had become, Ava realized, a regular feature of time spent with him. The ability to be in silence without it needing to be filled, which was rarer than people acknowledged. "I need to talk to you about the acquisition," Liam said. Ava put her fork down. "Okay. My original position was the number I gave your M&A team 4 months ago, the valuation I told your people I'd consider." He paused. "I'm going back to that number, the original one." She blinked. "That number was 30% below what I offered in the revised proposal." "I know." "Liam, the revised number is fair. It's what the company is worth. The original number is what I told your team before any of this," he said. "Before I knew about Kane, before the situation changed. I didn't hold out because I was playing strategy on the price. I held out because I wasn't sure yet." He held her gaze. "I'm sure now, and the original number was fair to both of us. I don't need the extra 30% to feel okay about this." She looked at him. "That's a significant amount of money." "Yes, most people wouldn't do that. Most people are also not in the specific situation I'm in." He said it without elaboration. She understood what he meant. The situation was not just the acquisition. The situation was everything. The weeks, the conversations, the coffee shops, the evidence on her kitchen table, the glitter on his wrist, the way he'd said, "I'm not going anywhere," and had in fact not gone anywhere. The situation was the two of them sitting in a bad lighting diner at noon on a Sunday after the most important morning of her professional career, talking about eggs. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't complicate things," she said. "Which part?" "The acquisition and the other part, both running at the same time." She looked at him. "I don't have a clean way to separate them." "They're not meant to be separated," he said. "One happened because of the other. That's just what it is." A pause. "I'm not asking you to separate them, Ava. I'm asking you to accept that both things can be real at the same time." She sat with that. The diner moved around them. A family with kids in the next booth. A counter full of older men with coffee and strong opinions about the game from last night. The background noise of a Sunday morning that had no idea about board meetings or evidence chains or any of it. "I'm not very good at the personal part," she said. It came out more plainly than she'd planned. "I'm good at the work. The personal part, I've let that go quiet for a long time." "I know," he said. "You think I haven't noticed?" She looked at him. "You're not warm with people you don't trust," he said. "You're efficient, you're fair, but you're careful." He turned the coffee cup on the table. "The first time I saw you be warm was when you asked about Emma at the coffee shop. You said she sounded like someone you'd like, and you meant it, and then you got this look like you couldn't believe you'd said it." She remembered that moment. She'd thought she'd managed it invisibly. Apparently not. "I don't want you to be different," he said quietly. "I just want you to know it's okay to not manage everything." She looked at the table. She had a habit of looking at tables. "I don't know how to do that yet." "I know," he said. "Neither do I, completely. It's been a long time since Emma's mom left, and most of that time I've been running on the understanding that the two most important things in my life are Emma and the work. That was clean. It was workable." He paused. "Then I walked into a lobby with a blueprint and a pencil, and someone asked me a stupid question, and I said something I hadn't planned to say." "It wasn't stupid," she said. "No, it wasn't." He looked at her. "I meant what I said, right then. It was a crazy thing to say to a stranger, but I meant it." She thought about that moment, the lobby, the Tuesday morning, the joke she'd thrown out without thinking, the complete absence of the response she'd expected, the way his steadiness had snapped something in her attention that she hadn't been able to unsnap since. "I know you meant it," she said. "That was the problem." He smiled, the full one, the crooked one that she'd been trying not to think about specifically and had been thinking about specifically anyway. "We figure out the acquisition paperwork this week," he said, "and then we figure out the rest." "That's a very loose plan." "Yes," he said. "Do you have a better one?" She considered. "No," she admitted. He picked up his coffee. "Then that's the plan." She picked up hers. It was genuinely terrible coffee. She didn't mind. Outside the diner window, Chicago went on with its Sunday. The particular ease of a city at half speed, people walking dogs, kids on bikes, a couple arguing mildly about something on the opposite sidewalk, and then laughing about it. The lake was out there somewhere, flat and gray and permanent. Ava had walked into this day knowing it could go either direction. That was what it meant to move on something real. You prepared as well as you could, and then you showed up and you did it. And the outcome was not entirely in your hands no matter how much of yourself you put into it. It had gone the right direction. She was sitting in a diner with bad coffee and good eggs, and a man across from her who had said, "I'm not going anywhere," and had meant it in all the ways a person could mean a thing, and the company she'd built from nothing was still hers, and the case was on record, and the truth had a shape that the documentation would hold. She was not, she noticed, calculating anything. That was new. She was just sitting in a diner on a Sunday morning, and it was enough. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A text from Madison. "I saw the meeting notes on the board system. Just wanted to say, you did it. That's all." She put the phone face down. "Good news?" Liam said. "Yes," she said. She finished her coffee. The family in the next booth was having a small argument about dessert. The men at the counter had moved on from the game to the weather. Somewhere, Victor Kane was calling his attorney on a Sunday, which was the most unpleasant kind of call to make, and that was fine. And Ava did not spend more than 4 seconds thinking about it. There was paperwork ahead. There was the acquisition formalization and the regulatory process and the board restructuring and the long, unglamorous work of a company that had come through something and needed to be steadied and moved forward. There was Emma, who she hadn't met yet, and who built water pumps and asked why clouds were flat on the bottom and thought the answers to most scientific questions were disappointing, but okay. There was a lot of territory she hadn't mapped and no guarantee about any of it. Liam was looking out the window. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you." she said. For everything, the documentation, the waiting, the not going anywhere. A pause. All of it. He looked at her for a moment. You did the hard part, he said. We both did, she said. He didn't argue with that. The acquisition paperwork took 11 days. 11 days of attorneys and term sheets and regulatory filings and the particular grinding patience of two legal teams who agreed on the substance and disagreed on the language, which was the most common and most tedious kind of disagreement in corporate law. Ava sat through 6 of those sessions herself, which was more than a CEO typically did at this stage, and she did it deliberately. Not because she didn't trust her team, but because she wanted Liam across the table from her in those rooms, wanted to be the person he was negotiating with directly instead of through layers of representation. It was not always comfortable. On the 4th day, they had a genuine argument about the retention structure for the Nexus engineering team, specifically about the terms under which key personnel could be poached by competitors during a transition period, and the mechanisms for enforcing those terms. Liam thought her proposal was too restrictive. Ava thought his counterproposal was too loose. They went back and forth for 40 minutes with their respective attorneys sitting at the table in the slightly uncomfortable posture of professionals watching their clients handle something directly that they were usually paid to handle themselves. You're protecting the asset class, Liam said, not the people. Those are different things. I'm protecting the value of what I'm acquiring, Ava said, which is the same thing. It isn't. He put his pen down. A restrictive non-solicit tells Rosa she's being locked in place. It signals that the acquisition is about control, not investment. She'll feel it. She'll feel it if she tries to leave within 18 months of close. If she doesn't try to leave, she'll feel nothing. That's a management philosophy I fundamentally disagree with, he said. I know you disagree with it. I'm telling you why it's the right call. He looked at her with that steady, assessing quality. No, he said. You're telling me why it's your default. That's not the same as why it's right. The room was quiet. One of the attorneys made a small, almost inaudible note on his legal pad. Ava looked at the table. She thought about it. Actually thought about it, not just located the argument she'd been about to make. She thought about what he'd said about Rosa, about the offer letters she'd turned down, about the culture being the actual asset. She thought about the Alderman Tech situation that Liam had raised in their first real conversation, the engineering team she'd absorbed and the product line she'd discontinued, and the 14-month timeline that had, when she was honest about it, moved faster than she'd originally intended. 12 months, she said. Not 18. He looked at her. 12 months with a mutual opt-out clause that requires written agreement from the employee in both companies, she said. It's not about locking anyone in. It's about a stable transition period. 12 months is fair. He was quiet for a moment. 12 months with a 6-month review built in, he said. If retention rates are healthy at 6 months, the second half auto-converts to advisory only. She considered that. It was a better mechanism than what she'd proposed. She did not particularly enjoy that it was better, and she recognized that reaction as something to manage and set aside. Agreed, she said. The attorney on her left wrote something. The room moved on. Afterward, walking down the corridor toward the elevator, Liam said quietly, You don't like being wrong. Nobody likes being wrong, she said. Some people like it less than others. He held the elevator door. You did the right thing in there. I did the logical thing. Sometimes they're the same thing. He stepped in. That's not a small observation. She thought about that in the cab on the way back to the office. She thought about the pattern of her own resistance. The moment when she'd almost defended the 18-month structure, not because it was better, but because it was hers, and how close she'd come to doing it. How many times in 6 years had she done exactly that and not caught herself? How many rooms had she been in where the right answer was on the other side of her own position and she hadn't been able to see it because she was too busy being the smartest person there? She didn't know the answer. That bothered her more than the question. She went back to the office and worked until 7. Then she sat for a few minutes doing nothing, which was not something she usually did in her office, and which felt, oddly, like progress. The acquisition closed on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the board meeting. The signing was quiet. 3 people in Holt's West Loop office, No photographers, no press release drafted in advance, just the paperwork and the pens and the specific, unremarkable-looking moment when two signatures made something final that had been 11 months in the making. Liam signed first. She watched his hand move across the page and thought about the lobby, the blueprint, the pencil behind his ear, and the entire improbable chain of events between that morning and this one. She signed. The paralegal witnessed. Holt notarized. That was it. "Congratulations," Holt said, with the dry warmth of someone who considered this outcome a professional satisfaction and wasn't going to make more of it than that. They took the elevator down together. On the street, the November air was sharp, and the sky was the particular deep blue that only showed up in Chicago on cold, clear days, the kind that looked painted. "That's it," Liam said. Not with drama, just noting it. "That's it," Ava agreed. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. They were not, Ava thought, very good at ceremonial moments. Either of them. They were better at the working parts, the arguing parts, the sitting in diners parts. But they were here, on this sidewalk, on this November Thursday, with this specific thing behind them. "Emma wants to meet you," Liam said. Ava looked at him. "When did that come up?" "I mentioned I'd been spending time with someone. She asked who. I said her name was Ava. She asked if you were nice. I said yes." A pause. "She said she'd be the judge of that." Ava felt the corner of her mouth lift. "She sounds like she doesn't take your word for things." "She really doesn't," he said, with a parental pride that was entirely helpless about itself. "Saturday, if you're free, there's a park near my place. She's been testing a new kite design, and she wants an audience with opinions." "I have opinions about kites," Ava said. "Do you?" "No, but I can develop some." He smiled. "Saturday," he said. She nodded. Saturday. They went their separate directions. She walked 4 blocks to where Madison was waiting with the car, and she looked up at the blue sky over the city, and she thought, 11 months ago I sent a cold acquisition proposal to a company I'd never seen, owned by a man I'd never met. And now I am standing on a sidewalk in November thinking about developing opinions on kite design. Life, she thought, had a very specific sense of humor. The Victor Kane situation resolved in its own slow, grinding way over the following weeks. He resigned from the board 8 days after the meeting through a letter drafted by his attorney that was so carefully worded it managed to be 2 pages long while saying almost nothing. The SEC referral moved forward. Holt had been right. It would take months, probably longer. There would be depositions and document requests and the long procedural machinery of regulatory oversight doing its work. Gary Ellison, it turned out, had 4 other client relationships with similar structures, different companies, different board members, similar patterns of information laundering. The SEC, once they had Ava's referral and the documentation chain, found the others. It became a larger investigation than it had started as, which was not something Ava had anticipated, and which she found privately both satisfying and slightly unsettling. She had meant to protect her own company. She had apparently also inadvertently protected several others. She told Liam about it over dinner the following week, not at a restaurant, at his apartment, which was the first time she'd been there. It was a real apartment, kids' drawings on the refrigerator, a half-assembled something on the living room floor that she suspected was part of an ongoing engineering project, books on surfaces that were not bookshelves, a general evidence of life being lived in a space rather than managed in it. She had stood in the hallway for a moment after he opened the door and felt strongly and specifically the difference between his home and her own. Emma was not there that first evening. She was at her friend Sophie's for a sleepover, but her presence was everywhere in the apartment in the way children's presences were, pervasive and specific. Ava touched the edge of a drawing taped to the kitchen doorframe and thought about the photograph she'd seen months ago, the beaming girl with the water filtration system, and felt something she couldn't entirely name. "You're looking at everything," Liam said from the kitchen, where he was doing something that smelled good. "I look at spaces," she said. "Habit." "What's the verdict?" She looked around the living room, the half project on the floor, the books, the drawing on the doorframe, the lamp that was slightly too bright for the corner it was in and that had clearly been placed for reading rather than aesthetics. "Lived in," she said. In the good way. Not what you expected. She considered. I expected it to be more controlled, she admitted. You seem like someone who controls things. He appeared in the doorway. I control work things, he said. I decided a long time ago not to control home things. Emma runs mostly feral in this apartment, and that's intentional. Feral, Ava said. She moved all the couch cushions to the floor on Tuesday and declared them a country. I ate dinner in that country. I wasn't consulted about the founding. He went back to the kitchen. I'm at peace with it. Ava smiled at the room. She bent and picked up the thing on the floor. It was a small gear mechanism, partially assembled, with a handwritten diagram beside it in the uncertain but concentrated print of a 6-year-old. The diagram was labeled in 2 places. One said Gear 1, and one said, inexplicably, Steve. She didn't ask. She set it down carefully, in approximately the configuration she'd found it. They ate at the kitchen table, which had a ring stain on one end that had clearly been there long enough to be permanent, and they talked about the Ellison investigation and the Nexus integration, and a conference call Ava had taken that morning with the Seattle office of Nexus that had been unexpectedly good. Rosa had joined the call at the end, briefly, and said 2 things that demonstrated she understood the strategic architecture of the integration better than half of Ava's own senior team. I told you, Liam said. You told me, she agreed. Extensively. I'm going to need that on record. It is not going on record. He smiled and refilled her water glass, which was a small and unremarkable thing that she registered anyway, the way she was starting to register small things about him that she hadn't expected to care about. Saturday came. The park was about 8 blocks from Liam's apartment, a real Chicago park, not a manicured one, with old trees and a slightly uneven path, and the late November cold sitting in the air with real intent. Ava arrived wearing a coat that was probably not warm enough, which she acknowledged to herself and refused to make a production of. Emma was already there. She was 6 years old, and she came up to approximately Ava's elbow, and she had her father's dark eyes and a bright orange coat and a kite under one arm that she was carrying with the focused possessiveness of someone transporting something important. She looked at Ava the way children looked at people they'd been told things about, assessing, direct, not unkind, but also not giving anything away. Hi, Emma said. Hi, Ava said. A short pause. Emma looked at Ava's coat. That's not warm enough, she said. I know, Ava said. Emma considered this. Apparently honesty about inadequate coats was an acceptable quality. Okay, she said, and turned to her father. The wind is coming from the north, which is good for the kite because it needs crosswind, but that angle is actually better. Liam looked at Ava. She's been researching wind patterns, he said, with the expression of a parent in the presence of a fixation they have accepted but not entirely caught up with. I did research, Emma confirmed. Can we go now? They went to the open section of the park, a broad flat stretch where the trees thinned out and the sky opened up. Emma handed Ava the end of the kite string without asking, with the authority of someone assigning roles on a project team, and then took the kite itself about 20 feet away and held it up. You have to back up, she told Ava. Not too fast. I'll tell you when. Ava backed up. She was holding the string of a kite in a Chicago park in November in an insufficient coat, receiving instructions from a 6-year-old, and she was not managing anything about this moment, and that was fine. Now, Emma said. Ava let the string out. The wind caught the kite. Emma let go. The kite went up in a wobbly, lurching arc that was not elegant but was entirely real. The kind of flight that came from work and wind and a 6-year-old who had done her research. Emma made a sound that was pure, uncomplicated delight. She ran a few steps, arms out, watching it go. Ava watched the kite and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Not the professional tightness, not the strategic alertness she'd been carrying for months. Something older than that. Something she'd been carrying since she was young enough to be assigned roles on kite-flying projects, and hadn't had anyone to assign them. She didn't examine it too carefully. She just let it be there. Liam came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He watched Emma run back and forth in her orange coat under the gray-blue November sky, yelling periodic updates about wind direction at nobody in particular. She's wonderful, Ava said quietly. Yeah, he said. Just that. But the way he said it, the simple, total sureness of it, was the realest thing she'd heard in a long time. They flew the kite for 40 minutes. Emma's design had a flaw in the left tail that caused it to drift, which Emma identified herself on the third flight and corrected with a piece of extra string from her coat pocket, which she'd apparently packed specifically for this contingency. The corrected kite flew better. Emma made a note on a small pad she also produced from her coat pocket. She carries equipment, Ava said to Liam. She's been doing it since she was 4, he said. I found a ruler in her coat last winter. I don't know why. I didn't ask. At some point, Emma came back and stood beside Ava and looked up at the kite with her. Do you like kites? Emma asked. I think I do, Ava said. I haven't flown one since I was young. Emma processed this. Did you have a good one? Honestly, I don't remember. I think it was a plain red one. Red is good, Emma said, with the authority of someone who had done the research. High visibility, good for finding if it crashes. That's practical. Yeah. Emma was quiet for a moment. Dad said you work with him now. I do, Ava said. In a way. He said you're smart. He's smart too. Emma looked up at her sideways, the way children looked at you when they were checking whether you were being real or being adult. Whatever she found seemed adequate. Okay, she said, and ran back toward the open space, apparently having concluded the assessment. Ava looked at Liam. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, the one that arrived and left quickly, the one she'd spent weeks trying not to think about too specifically. Except this time it stayed a little longer. What? She said. Nothing, he said. She likes you. She said okay. That's not the same as liking. With Emma, he said, okay is exactly the same as liking. You passed. Ava looked back at the small orange figure running across the brown November grass under the big sky. Something about the image stayed with her, stayed in the specific particular way that things stayed when they were going to mean something later. They got lunch afterward at a place near the park that Emma selected, which turned out to be a diner not unlike the one in the West Loop, with similar bad lighting and a children's menu that Emma studied with the focus of someone reviewing a contract. The grilled cheese has 3 kinds, Emma informed them. I've had the regular one. I'm trying the second kind today. Scientific approach, Ava said. You have to try them in order, Emma said. Otherwise you don't know which one is better. That's actually correct methodology, Ava said. Emma looked at her father. She knows about experiments. She knows about a lot of things, Liam said. Obviously, Emma said, and went back to the menu, the verdict clearly rendered. They stayed for an hour and a half, which was longer than Ava had planned and exactly as long as it needed to be. Emma told her about a boy in her class named Felix who claimed he could hold his breath for 4 minutes, which Emma considered implausible, and about the water pump from last year's science fair, which she explained with a technical precision that was slightly beyond what Ava had expected from a 6-year-old, and about the fact that she had recently become interested in volcanoes. Underwater ones especially, Emma said. They're the biggest and nobody talks about them. That's a fair complaint, Ava said. I know, Emma said, with the gravity of someone who had been making fair complaints into the void for some time and was relieved to find a sympathetic audience. Liam watched the two of them and said almost nothing during this stretch of conversation, in the way of a parent who was present and content to be in the background. Ava noticed it. She noticed specifically what it cost him to be this open, to bring her here, to this park, to this diner, into this part of his life that was not work, not strategic, not defensible with documentation. Emma was the thing he couldn't protect with a good argument. She was the thing that was simply his, entirely, and he had chosen to bring Ava into the same space as her. She understood what that meant. She didn't underestimate it. After lunch, walking back toward the park to get the car, Emma took Ava's hand without preamble or explanation. Just reached up and took it, the way children took hands when they decided someone was safe, without consulting the decision with anyone. Ava looked down at the small hand in hers. She thought, I was not prepared for this. She thought, I don't think you're supposed to be prepared for this. She held on. The weeks after that had their own texture. different from the months before, less driven by urgency, less structured around the next crisis. The Nexus integration moved forward. Rosa's team folded into the Sinclair Capital portfolio with a smoothness that Ava later told Liam was almost suspicious, and he said that was what happened when you integrated people who wanted to be somewhere. And she wrote that down and didn't tell him she'd written it down. The SEC investigation continued its slow work. Holt sent updates that Ava read and filed. Victor Kane's attorney made one attempt at a quiet resolution that Holt declined on Ava's behalf, and after that there was silence from that direction. The board restructured. 2 new members joined, one recommended by Farrow, one by Choi, both of whom had track records Ava had reviewed carefully before agreeing. The board felt different in its first full meeting without Kane's particular presence. Not lighter, exactly, but cleaner, like a room where you'd finally found the source of a persistent smell. Raymond Choi stopped her in the corridor after that first new meeting. "I want to say something," he said. He had the slightly uncomfortable posture of a man who was saying something he'd decided to say, rather than something that came naturally. "Okay," she said. "I should have seen Kane sooner. I've been on boards for a long time, and I have a good record of, I should have seen it." He met her eyes. "I voted with you because the evidence was unambiguous. But I want you to know I also voted with you because of how you brought it. The fact that you waited until you had something real, that you didn't come in before you were sure." A pause. "A lot of people in your position would have moved sooner and made a mess of it." "A lot of people in my position also got it wrong in the other direction," she said. "I almost moved too late." "But you didn't," he said. She thought about that later. She thought about the months of building the case, the patience she hadn't entirely had naturally and had constructed because she understood what was required. She thought about Liam saying the timeline isn't mine, and the way that had irritated her and the way it had turned out to be right. She thought about the long, unglamorous work of trusting the process when the process felt too slow. She'd always understood the work. She was starting to understand the waiting. They had dinner together on a Thursday in December, just the 2 of them, at a restaurant neither of them had been to before. Liam's pick, a small Italian place in Wicker Park that had 4 tables and a handwritten menu, and a proprietor who appeared briefly to explain 2 of the dishes with an intensity that suggested he had opinions about pasta. The food was very good. They talked about nothing in particular for the first half, and then, the way their conversations always eventually did, found their way into real territory. "I've been thinking about something," Liam said. "What?" He turned his wine glass. "When I walked into your lobby that morning, the first time, I'd seen photographs of you, the company website, the one profile piece you did with the Chicago Tribune. I knew who you were. I'd been in that building 4 times before and never run into you." He paused. "That morning I came in early because one of the crew had a question about the secondary duct specs that I wanted to look at before the work started. I wasn't planning to be there when you arrived." Ava looked at him. "You're saying it was an accident." "I'm saying the timing was an accident." He looked at her. The answer wasn't. She understood what he meant. When she'd asked the stupid question, the rhetorical, thrown-away question about his last date, she'd expected nothing. She'd expected him to be flustered or to laugh or to give her a non-answer that disappeared into the lobby air. Instead, he'd said something real, and it had been real not because he was performing. She'd spent enough time with him now to know the difference between his performances and his reality, the thin line between his professional steadiness and the deeper thing underneath it, but because he had meant it, even if he hadn't entirely planned to say it. "You knew who I was," she said. "Yes." "And you still said it." "Yes." A pause. "I thought, this woman is going to keep walking and I'm going to go back to the blueprint, and that'll be that. I said it because I meant it, not because I thought it was going anywhere." She thought about that. "What made you mean it?" He considered the question seriously. "You asked a ridiculous question," he said, with complete confidence, like you were entitled to ask anyone anything, and the universe had agreed to that arrangement. He smiled slightly. "I found that interesting." "That's a generous read of arrogance," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but there's a specific kind of confidence that isn't arrogance. You were walking through your own building at 7:43 in the morning fully present, fully awake, fully there. Most people at 7:43 are somewhere else in their head. He shrugged. I noticed, that's all. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't notice you, she said. That's what made me notice you. I know, he said. They sat with that. The restaurant was quiet around them, the proprietor having retreated to the kitchen with strong feelings about his pasta, the other 3 tables occupied with their own Thursday evening lives. I'm not good at this, she said. The relationship part. I should tell you that clearly. I'm better at it than I was 3 months ago, which isn't saying much, but I'm telling you so you know what you're working with. I know what I'm working with, he said. You say that. I do say that, and I mean it. He met her eyes. I'm not looking for someone who's already figured everything out. That would be its own kind of problem. A pause. I'm looking for someone who's trying, who's honest about the trying, who doesn't pretend to be further along than they are. He looked at her. You are, demonstrably, those things. She looked at the table looking again. She was aware of it. She was working on it. Emma told me last night that she thinks you should come to her school's winter science fair, Liam said. It's in 2 weeks. She said, and I'm quoting, that she needs someone there who understands methodology. Ava looked up. She said methodology? She got it from somewhere, he said. I choose not to investigate. Ava thought about the park, the orange coat, the small hand in hers, uncomplicated and decided. Tell her I'll be there, she said. He nodded. Something in his expression settled. The way a person looked when something they'd wanted was confirmed, quietly, without the need to make an event of it. The dinner ended the way good dinners ended. Unhurried, warm, the cold air outside a contrast they both walked out into without complaint. He walked her the 2 blocks to where she'd parked, which was longer than necessary because she'd parked in the wrong direction, a fact she'd known when she did it. On the sidewalk, in the December dark with the city lit up around them and the cold doing what Chicago cold did in December, not asking permission, just arriving completely, he kissed her. Not dramatically, not with the weight of everything that had come before it, or not with the performance of that weight. Just simply, the way you did something when you decided to do it and there wasn't any good reason to wait any longer. She kissed him back. That was also simple. That was also real. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment afterward. A cab went past. Somewhere up the street, someone was carrying something awkward and large and negotiating a doorway with mixed results. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. She drove home through the December city with the lake appearing in glimpses between the buildings and the heat in the car not quite enough, and the radio on something she didn't recognize and didn't change. She was not running calculations. She was not mapping the next 3 months or the integration timeline or the restructured board agenda for January. She was thinking about a winter science fair in 2 weeks and a 6-year-old who needed someone there who understood methodology and a man who had walked into her lobby with a blueprint and said something real when she'd expected nothing. She was thinking about the question she'd asked with arrogance and the answer she'd received without any, and the entire improbable distance between that Tuesday morning and this December night. She'd built a company because she needed to prove something. She'd defended it because it was hers. She'd fought for it the way you fought for things you'd made from nothing, fiercely, and sometimes at the cost of other things she hadn't fully accounted for. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, between the lobby and the board meeting and the coffee shops and the park and the diner and the wrong direction parking spot on a December Thursday, somewhere in the middle of everything she'd been trying to protect and acquire and win, she'd been given something she hadn't known to look for. Not a deal. Not a victory. Not evidence. Just the ordinary, imperfect, completely specific gift of someone who had seen her clearly, the whole picture, the sharp edges and the gaps and the long history of choosing work over everything else, and had stood in a lobby with a blueprint and said, right now, with you. She hadn't understood what that meant that morning. She was starting to understand it now. The lake appeared one more time in the gap between 2 buildings, flat and dark and perfectly itself, and then the street turned and it was gone. She got home. She went upstairs. She stood at the window for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of achievement. Then she went to bed. For the first time in a long time, she slept 8 full hours. She did not set an alarm. When she woke, it was light, and the lake was there, and the city was starting its day without asking her permission. She thought, this is what it feels like when you stop running towards something and find out you've already arrived. She thought, I could get used to this. She thought, I think I already have.